There is a place in North America where the ground keeps secrets the way stone keeps cold. Long after the sun has moved across the sky and the air above has warmed, the stone below stays cold, stays dark, stays patient. Quebec City sits on a promontory above the St. Lawrence River, and it has been doing so for thousands of years before the French gave it a name, thousands of years before any European eye rested on the cliffs that drop toward the water, thousands of years before the first timber palisade went up and someone decided to call it a capital. It is one of the oldest continuously occupied places in North America that still functions as a living city. The foundations of what people built here go down and down and down, and somewhere in that downward direction, something was found in the year 1898 that was quietly noted, quietly filed, and quietly never spoken of again in any official report. This is the story of what happened when a small expedition went below the surface of Quebec's oldest quarter and came back up with questions that the institutions of 1898 were not prepared to answer. It is also the story of what was already there before any expedition went looking, what the Wendat and Algonquin peoples had described for generations about the character of the ground beneath the promontory, what the geology of the site actually suggests when you look at it carefully, and what the convergence of those three things means for our understanding of who was in North America and for how long and doing what. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The promontory that Quebec City occupies is called Cap Diamant. The name came from French explorers who mistook the quartz crystals glittering in the cliffs for diamonds and reported back to Europe that they had found something extraordinary. They had found something extraordinary, though not what they thought. What they had found was a piece of elevated ground that made military and logistical sense the way very few places on the continent did. The St. Lawrence River narrows at this point. The cliff face on the southern exposure drops nearly 100 meters to the lower town. The rock beneath the city is a mixture of limestone, shale, and harder cap rock, and it has been subject to the same geological processes that have shaped this entire stretch of the St. Lawrence Valley for hundreds of millions of years. Long before the French arrived, the Wendat people knew this place as Stadacona. Jacques Cartier encountered a community here in 1535 when he came up the river for the first time and asked the people he met what the land was called. What he heard, or thought he heard, was something that sounded like the word Kanata, which in the Huron-Iroquoian family of languages simply meant village or settlement. From that one misheard or misunderstood exchange came the name of an entire country, but the settlement itself, the community at Stadacona, was not a novelty in 1535. It had been there for a very long time, and the people of Stadacona had been there for longer still. And the Wendat oral tradition about the place where the great river narrowed and the cliff rose above the water was not a recent accumulation of knowledge. There is a category of information in indigenous oral traditions of northeastern North America that scholars of the early 20th century tended to treat as myth in the dismissive sense, meaning stories that might contain symbolic or spiritual meaning but should not be taken as historical or geographical data. This dismissal has been revised substantially in the decades since, and the revision has come from a very concrete direction. When researchers have taken the time to compare specific geographical and geological claims embedded in oral traditions against what the archaeological and geological record actually shows, they have found correspondences that are too precise and too consistent to be coincidental. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that accurately described coastlines submerged 7,000 years ago, the Pacific Islander navigation traditions that encoded star and current knowledge accurate enough to reach the most remote islands in the ocean, the Klamath oral account of the eruption that created Crater Lake, accurate in its description of a mountain falling inward rather than blasting outward. These are not the exceptions to a general rule of oral tradition vagueness. They are examples of what oral traditions do when the knowledge they carry matters enough to preserve carefully. The Wendat and Algonquin traditions about Cap Diamant and the ground beneath it fall into this category. What those traditions describe, in accounts documented by Jesuit missionaries and later by ethnographers, is a place where the ground goes down in ways that human hands help determine, not in the vague sense of a spiritual underworld, but in the geographically specific sense of passages and spaces that the old ones made or shaped or extended, in places where natural openings in the limestone were modified, in places where the cliff face has apertures that are not entirely the result of natural erosion alone. These accounts survived despite being recorded almost always by outsiders who were predisposed to interpret them as either superstition or as garbled references to ordinary caves. They survived because the knowledge they contained was important enough to transmit even under conditions of enormous cultural disruption, even during the period of mission activity that reshaped so much of the Wendat world in the 17th century. To understand what the 1898 expedition found, you need to understand the geological character of Cap Diamant, because the geology is the first piece of evidence that any serious assessment has to grapple with. The promontory is composed primarily of Ordovician, limestone and shale, formations that are between 400 and 500 million years old. Limestone is a soluble rock. Given sufficient time, sufficient water, and sufficient acidity in that water, limestone dissolves. It dissolves along fractures, along bedding planes, along any path where water can move through it. The result of this dissolution process, played out over geological time, is karst. Karst is the technical term for a landscape shaped primarily by the dissolution of soluble rock, and it produces a characteristic suite of features: sinkholes, disappearing streams, springs that emerge from the base of cliffs, and underground passages ranging from narrow fractures to cathedral-sized chambers. The St. Lawrence lowlands, which extend on both sides of the river in this region, are extensively karstic. The limestone that underlies much of this landscape has been dissolving since it was first exposed above sea level, and the result is a subsurface that is far more complex and far more full of void space than the surface would suggest. Quebec City itself sits on the northern edge of this karstic zone, and the cliff face of Cap Diamant exposes the stratigraphy directly. If you stand below the cliff and look up, you can see the banding of different rock layers, the lighter limestone alternating with darker shale, and you can see where water has done its work, where the cliff face is undercut, where there are recesses and openings that go back into the rock. The question that matters for this story is not whether there are natural void spaces in and beneath Cap Diamant. There are. The question is whether any of those void spaces show evidence of human modification, and if so, of what age and of what kind. This is the question that the 1898 expedition was trying to answer, though not in those precise terms. The expedition was organized in the context of a particular intellectual and institutional moment in Quebec, and to understand what it found and what happened to its findings afterward, you need to understand that moment as well. In 1898, Quebec City was engaged in a particular kind of civic self-examination. The city was approaching the 300th anniversary of Champlain's founding of the settlement in 1608, and there was a significant among the historical and archaeological interest in the physical evidence of the city's past. Buildings were being documented, old maps were being consulted, and there was growing awareness that the layering of the city, the way successive eras of building had covered earlier foundations and earlier ground surfaces, contained information that was being lost to development and modification. A number of individuals connected to the Université Laval and to the Quebec Literary and Historical Society, the oldest learned society in Canada, had been discussing the possibility of a more systematic investigation of what lay beneath the oldest parts of the city. The expedition itself was small. 3 men were primarily involved in the underground portion of the work. The first was a geologist connected to the Geological Survey of Canada, a man whose published work on the stratigraphy of the St. Lawrence Valley was well regarded. The second was an archaeologist, or more precisely a man who had trained in classical archaeology in Europe and was one of the few people in Canada at that time with any systematic experience of underground investigation. The third was a local guide, a French-Canadian labourer who knew the older parts of the city the way people know places they have lived in their entire lives, including the stories that circulate at the level of family memory and neighbourhood tradition rather than written record. The expedition entered the subsurface of the old city through a basement opening in a building in the Bassaville, the lower town, near the foot of the cliff. This was not unusual. The buildings of the lower town, in 1898, still incorporated sections of older foundations, and it was known among builders and property owners that the basements of some buildings connected to older voids or passages in the rock below. The guide knew of such a connection in this particular building, and this is where the local knowledge that he brought to the expedition proved essential. Without that knowledge, the expedition would not have known where to enter, and without the entry point, it would not have found what it found. What the guide knew, and what he had heard from his father and his grandfather, was that there was a way down into the rock from this basement that went significantly deeper than the basement itself, and that this passage connected to a space that was not like a natural cave. His family's tradition about this space was that it was very old, older than the city, and that the old people, by which he meant the indigenous people who had lived here before the French, had known about it and used it for purposes that the family tradition did not specify clearly, but associated with ceremony and with the preservation of important things. This is exactly the kind of family-level oral transmission that historians trained in documentary evidence tend to dismiss. And it is exactly the kind of transmission that, when checked against physical reality, repeatedly turns out to contain accurate geographical information. The three men went down. The passage from the basement into the rock was narrow, requiring them to move in single file, with their lanterns held ahead of them, and it descended at an angle that was neither vertical nor horizontal, but somewhere between. Following what the geologist later noted in his private correspondence, was clearly a natural fracture in the limestone that had been widened and smoothed at some earlier time. The widening was what caught his attention. Natural fractures in limestone widen by dissolution, and dissolved limestone leaves characteristic irregular surfaces, textured and pitted by the differential action of acidic water on the calcite crystals in the rock. What the geologist observed on the walls of this passage was that while the underlying fracture was natural, the surface of the rock in the portion wide enough for a person to move through had been worked. The irregularities had been removed. The surface was smoother than dissolution alone would produce, smooth in the way that stone becomes smooth when it is abraded repeatedly by tools or by traffic, by hands and tools, and the passage of bodies over a long period of time. This observation was important enough that the geologist noted it specifically, and his notation of it is one of the threads that can be followed backward through the archival record today, because the private correspondence in which he described this detail survived even when the expedition's official report did not. The official report, if one was ever written in a complete form, is not in the collections of any institution in Quebec or in the federal archives. What exists are several pieces of correspondence between expedition participants, a brief notice in the proceedings of the Quebec Literary and Historical Society that references the expedition without describing its findings in any detail, and the private journal of the archaeologist, which is held in a university archive and which was examined by a historian of science in the 1990s, whose work forms one of the primary sources for understanding what happened below Cap Diamant in 1898. The passage widened after approximately 40 meters of descent. The geologist's letter describes the transition from the narrow descending fracture to what he calls a more considerable space, with some care. He was a scientist trained to describe what he observed rather than what he expected, and his description is precise. The space into which the passage opened was not a natural cave in the sense that he had encountered natural caves before. It was not irregular in the way that dissolution-formed chambers are irregular, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites rising from the floor and walls that curve and bulge and retreat in the asymmetric patterns that moving water carves over millennia. It was a room. He uses the word chambre, chamber, in French, and he uses it deliberately and without apparent embarrassment, because what he was looking at had the character of an enclosed and bounded space that had been shaped with some intention toward regularity. The ceiling was not level in the way a constructed ceiling would be level, but it was more nearly level than a natural cave ceiling typically is. And the archaeologist's journal adds the detail that the ceiling showed evidence of having been worked, of having projections and irregularities removed, creating a surface that, while not flat, was consistently at a height that allowed standing upright throughout the space. The geologist estimated the chamber at perhaps 15 meters in its longest dimension and 8 to 10 meters across, though he acknowledged that the conditions of observation, 3 men with lanterns in an enclosed space, made precise measurement difficult. What he was confident about was the scale. This was not a small void or a widened fracture, but a substantial underground space. The floor was partly covered with sediment that had accumulated over a very long time. fine-grained material, deposited by water, moving through the space, in conditions the geologist associated with periodic flooding from the water table rather than active stream flow. In places where the sediment was thin or absent, the floor showed the same characteristic of the walls and ceiling, surfaces that were smoother than dissolution alone would produce, that showed the faint parallel striations of abrasion rather than the irregular texture of dissolution. The geologist described this as consistent with a floor surface that had been prepared and used, though he was careful in his letter not to make claims that went beyond what his geological training equipped him to make. The archaeologist was less restrained, or perhaps more precisely trained, to observe the things that a geologist might not have the vocabulary to name. His journal entry for the day of the expedition is the most detailed single document relating to what was found. He describes the chamber in terms that reflect his European training in the archaeology of classical and pre-classical sites. He had worked at sites in France and Italy where underground spaces of various kinds had been investigated, and he had a framework for thinking about what human modification of natural geological features looked like in different periods and in different cultural contexts. What he saw in the chamber beneath Cap Diamant, he wrote, was consistent with a space that had been used over a very long period by people who understood the geology of the site and who had systematically improved the natural void to make it more functional. More functional for what purpose? This is the question that the archaeologist's journal circles around without fully answering, partly because the conditions of the investigation did not permit a thorough examination of the chamber's contents, and partly because the archaeologist was a careful man who did not want to make claims he could not support. But he does describe several specific observations that are worth examining in detail. The first is a series of markings on the eastern wall of the chamber, low down, in the zone between the floor sediment and the level of a person's waist. These markings were not inscriptions in the sense of alphabetic writing or pictographic narrative. They were geometric, composed of repeated angular forms that the archaeologist compared to the incised decorations on ceramic vessels he had seen from northeastern North American indigenous traditions, but also noted as having parallels in European pre-Bronze Age rock art. He made sketch copies of several of them in his journal, and these sketches survive. They show a pattern of lines forming nested angular shapes, of the kind that archaeologists working in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region in the 20th century would come to associate with late archaic and woodland period artistic traditions. Though the archaeologist of 1898 did not have that framework available to him, and was working from a different, and in some ways, less developed scholarly context. The second observation was the presence, in a recess, on the northern side of the chamber, of what the archaeologist described as a collection of objects that had been placed there deliberately. He does not describe them in exhaustive detail, because the lantern light was insufficient for a careful examination. But he notes several things clearly. There were objects of organic material, or rather, the remains of what had once been organic material, that had partly decomposed but retained enough structure to be identifiable as worked wood and worked fibre. There were objects of stone that had been shaped, not flaked in the way that projectile points are flaked, but ground and polished in the way that some tool types and many ceremonial objects from this region are ground and polished. And there was something he describes as a quantity of red material, powdered or granular, that he recognized immediately as red ochre. Red ochre is iron oxide ground to a powder, and it appears in archaeological contexts across North America and the world in association with burial practices, with ceremonial activities, and with the preservation of objects of importance. Its presence in a deliberately placed collection in an underground chamber is not neutral. It points toward uses of this space that go beyond simple shelter or storage. The archaeologist knew this. His journal entry at this point becomes more careful, more hedged, as if he recognized that he was on interpretive ground, that his training and his institutional position required him to approach with caution. He notes the ochre, he notes the work stone and the remains of organic material. He does not say what he thinks it means. But the fact that he noted these things so carefully, and that his sketches of the wall markings are preserved alongside these descriptions, suggests that he understood the significance of what he had found. The third observation was in some ways the most striking, and the one that the geologist's correspondence addresses most directly. At the far end of the chamber, in the wall opposite the entry passage, there was another opening. Not as wide as the entry, not requiring the widening that the entry passage had clearly received, but a natural fracture that had been partly cleared and that gave access to what the geologist described, from the limited angle of observation available to him with his lantern, as additional passage beyond. He could not go further without more preparation, more light, more rope. The expedition had not come equipped for an extended underground investigation of this kind. They had come expecting to find a natural cave or a modest void space, the kind of thing that a brief inspection could characterize. What they had found was something that would require a serious and extended effort to fully investigate. The question of whether that effort was ever made is central to the mystery of 1898. The expedition's participants did not keep the discovery secret, exactly. The archaeologist's journal was not a private diary hidden away. The geologist's letters were addressed to colleagues. The brief notice in the Literary and Historical Society proceedings was a public document. However uninformative, it was about specifics. But no organized follow-up investigation is documented. No subsequent expedition to the chamber is recorded in any institutional archive that has been examined. The chamber and its contents, whatever they were, appear in the documentary record of 1898 and then effectively disappear from it. Why? This is the question that the historian of science, who examined the archaeologist's journal in the 1990s, spent considerable effort trying to answer, and her account of what she found is important for understanding not just the Quebec case, but the broader pattern of how anomalous discoveries in pre-Columbian North American archaeology have been handled by institutional structures that were not prepared to receive them. The year 1898 was a particular moment in the development of Canadian and North American institutional archaeology. The Geological Survey of Canada, founded in 1842, was the dominant institution for any kind of earth science investigation in the country, and it had a very specific mandate and a very specific set of intellectual priorities. The investigation of geological formations in the service of resource extraction and geological mapping was the core of what the survey did. The investigation of potential archaeological sites, especially sites that did not fit the established narrative of indigenous prehistory in northeastern North America, was not part of its mandate and was not something its leadership was disposed to encourage. The established narrative of indigenous prehistory in northeastern North America in 1898 was a relatively simple one by modern standards. It held that the peoples of the region, prior to European contact, had been mobile hunter-gatherers in the north and semi-sedentary horticulturalists in the south, that they had lived in above-ground settlements of wood construction that left no durable traces, and that their archaeological signature was primarily one of portable objects, of stone tools and ceramic vessels, and the bones of their meals, rather than of built or modified environments. Underground spaces of human construction did not fit this narrative. They had no place in it. The archaeologist who encountered the chamber beneath Cap Diamant found himself in possession of evidence that did not fit into the story that his field was telling about this part of the continent. This is not a conspiracy, it is something more structural, and in some ways, more interesting than a conspiracy. Conspiracies require active coordination, require people to deliberately suppress information they know to be true. What happened with the 1898 findings was something different. A discovery was made that the intellectual frameworks of the time simply had no place for, and in the absence of a framework to make sense of it, the institutional response was not suppression but inaction. No one wrote the official report, because no one knew what the official report should say. No follow-up investigation was organized, because no institution had the mandate, the resources, or the interpretive vocabulary to design one. The discovery fell into a gap between disciplines and between institutional mandates, and sat there, in the journal of an aging archaeologist and the private letters of a geologist who died in 1906, waiting for someone with a different set of questions to come looking. That someone, or more precisely the sequence of someones who have tried to reconstruct the story, began with the historian of science in the 1990s, continued with a geographer at a Quebec university, who in the early 2000s mapped the known void spaces beneath the old city and tried to locate the entry point the 1898 expedition had used, and has more recently included Indigenous scholars working within the Wendat and Algonquin nations, who have brought the oral tradition dimension of the story into conversation with the archival and geological evidence. The picture that emerges from these different lines of inquiry is not complete. It is not complete because the original investigation was so limited, because the key documents are fragmentary, and because no systematic modern investigation of the chamber described in the 1898 accounts has been conducted, but it is suggestive in ways that merit careful attention. The geographer's work in the early 2000s is particularly useful for establishing the geological plausibility of the 1,898 accounts. He collected records of void spaces encountered during construction and renovation work in the Old City from the mid-19th century onward, a period during which the city's rapid development produced a large number of accidental discoveries of underground spaces that were noted in construction records and engineering reports without being investigated in any systematic way. He found dozens of such records, distributed across the Old City with a spatial pattern that he described as consistent with a network of connected void spaces rather than a collection of isolated pockets. The geometry of the distribution, when mapped, pointed toward the area at the base of Cap Diamond near the foot of the cliff as a zone of higher void density, consistent with what you would expect in a karstic system where the cliff face provides pathways for water to enter the limestone and create voids. More significantly, he found 3 construction records from the period between 1880 and 1920 that described void encounters in the specific neighborhood where the 1898 expedition had entered the subsurface, and 2 of those records described observations that echoed what the expedition participants had reported. Smooth wall surfaces, inconsistent with purely natural dissolution, and in one case, a work stone feature that the construction foreman had simply described as a built thing and moved on from, because his job was to complete the construction, not to investigate anomalies in the ground. The oral tradition dimension requires a somewhat longer excursion, because to understand what the Wendat and Algonquin traditions say about the ground beneath Cap Diamant, you need to understand something about the history of those nations and their relationship to the place that became Quebec City, a history that is considerably more complex and considerably more tragic than the standard narrative of French colonization typically conveys. The Wendat Confederacy, also known historically as the Huron Confederacy, was a sophisticated political and cultural formation composed of 4 and later 5 nations who occupied a territory centered on what is now south-central Ontario, around Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe. They were agricultural, cultivating maize, beans and squash in fields around semi-permanent villages. They were organized into clans that cross-cut national boundaries, creating a network of kinship and obligation that gave the Confederacy its coherence. They were traders and diplomats of considerable skill, maintaining relationships with nations across a vast geographic range, including the Algonquin peoples of the Ottawa River Valley and the St. Lawrence, with whom they had long-standing and complex relationships of both cooperation and competition. The Wendat presence in the St. Lawrence Valley, including at Stadacona, the site of what became Quebec City, was well established by the time of European contact. The relationship between the Wendat of the interior and the communities of the St. Lawrence Valley is one of the more debated questions in the archaeology and ethnohistory of northeastern North America, because by the time Samuel de Champlain arrived in 1608, Stadacona, as Cartier had encountered it in 1535, was gone. The village was not there. The people were not there. Champlain found the site essentially empty of permanent habitation, occupied by various Algonquin-speaking groups who used it seasonally but had not built a permanent settlement there. What happened between 1535 and 1608? This is a question that archaeologists and historians have been trying to answer for generations without reaching a consensus. The most widely accepted explanation involves a combination of epidemic disease, which was devastating indigenous communities across the continent in the 16th century, even before sustained European presence on the St. Lawrence, and conflict with other nations, including possibly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which was expanding its territorial influence northward during this period. Whatever happened, the community at Stadacona was gone, but the knowledge of the site was not gone. The Wendat who survived, who eventually reconstituted themselves around Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe, retained knowledge of the St. Lawrence in their oral traditions, and that knowledge included specific geographical information about particular features of the landscape along the river. Among the Jesuit relations, the remarkable series of annual reports that the Jesuit missionaries in New France sent back to their superiors in Paris from 1632 to 1673, there are several passages that touch on Wendat knowledge of the old site at Stadacona. These passages are not the primary focus of the relations, which were concerned with the progress of missionary work and the spiritual condition of indigenous souls, but they appear in the margins of accounts of conversations between missionaries and Wendat elders, in the context of discussions about the geography of the country and the features that the Wendat regarded as significant. One passage, in the relation of 1647, describes a conversation in which a Wendat elder spoke of the place where the great river narrowed as having spaces within the rock where the old people had done important work that was done before anyone now living could remember, and that the ground there remembered what had been done, even if the people who did it were gone. The missionary who recorded this did not pursue the subject. He noted it as an example of what he considered the indigenous tendency to animate the landscape with spiritual significance, which was not something he took literally, but something he thought he should document as part of his general account of indigenous beliefs. He was not wrong that indigenous peoples of this region animated the landscape with spiritual significance. He was wrong in assuming that this spiritual significance was the only kind of significance being communicated, that the elder's statement that the ground remembered was purely metaphorical rather than also geographical and historical. A second relevant passage appears in the ethnographic notes of a 19th century scholar who worked extensively with Wendat communities and published a careful account of their traditions and worldview. He recorded an account that describes, in considerable detail, the features of the St. Lawrence Valley landscape that the Wendat regarded as ancestral places associated with the activities of their forebears before the great disruptions of the colonial period. Among these ancestral places, the place where the river narrows and the cliff rises, the place that the French called Cap Diamant, is described as a place where the old ones maintained rooms within the rock, rooms that required skill and effort to reach, rooms where certain things were kept, and where certain practices were conducted that he could not describe in full because the knowledge of their precise character had been lost in the disruptions of the 17th and 18th centuries. The phrase rooms within the rock appears in two different published accounts and in several unpublished documents from the 19th and early 20th centuries relating to Wendat oral tradition, and in each case it is associated specifically with Cap Diamant and with an attribution to a time before memory, meaning a time that even the oldest living members of the community in the 19th century did not have direct knowledge of, but that existed in their tradition as a fact about the past. The consistency of this specific geographical reference across different periods and different documenters is the kind of consistency that, in oral tradition research, indicates a tradition that has been carefully maintained rather than casually accumulated. Now, set the oral tradition alongside the geological evidence and the 1898 archival record and the pattern of construction-era void discoveries, and ask what picture emerges. The picture that emerges is one of a karstic limestone promontory that contains natural void spaces, some of which were modified by human activity over a period that began well before European contact, and that may have begun a very long time before European contact indeed. The question of how long before is one that cannot be answered from the 1898 accounts, because the 1898 expedition did not collect samples for dating analysis and did not have access to the radiometric dating methods that would be developed in the mid-20th century. But there is a geological dimension to the dating question that is worth pursuing even in the absence of direct dates. The sediment on the floor of the chamber, described by the geologist as fine-grained material accumulated over a very long time under conditions of periodic flooding, is itself a kind of clock. Sediment accumulation in underground spaces occurs at rates that depend on the character of the water supply and the suspended material it carries, and those rates vary, but they are not unlimited. If the floor sediment was thick enough for the geologist to describe it as covering much of the floor surface and as clearly representing a very long period of accumulation, then the chamber itself, whatever its origin, had been in its current accessible form for a considerable time. The geologist's language is not precise enough to put a number on this, but it is consistent with a timescale of centuries at minimum and potentially of millennia. The worked stone objects described by the archaeologist as being in the recess on the northern wall are also potentially informative about timescale, though again, without sampling and analysis, the information is inferential. Ground and polished stone objects appear in the archaeological record of northeastern North America from the late Archaic period onward, beginning roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and continuing through the woodland period and into the period of European contact. The specific character of the objects cannot be determined from the archaeologist's description alone, but the association with red ochre, which appears in the archaeological record of northeastern North America from a very early period indeed, including in the burial traditions of the maritime archaic culture that was active along the coasts and river valleys of this region from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before the present, suggests that the chamber and its contents might have a history extending back into what archaeologists would call the Archaic period, before the introduction of ceramics, and before the development of the horticultural traditions that characterized the Wendat and their predecessors. The maritime archaic culture is one of the great underappreciated civilizations of pre-Columbian North America. They were maritime hunters, primarily, following the great marine mammals, and the fish runs along the Atlantic coast and up the major rivers of the northeastern part of the continent. They buried their dead with elaborate care, using red ochre extensively in their burial practices, creating grave goods of worked stone and bone and shell that reflect a sophisticated aesthetic sense and a developed ceremonial tradition. Their sites extend from Labrador to the maritime provinces and into the Gulf of St. Lawrence region, and while their presence in the interior of what is now Quebec is less archaeologically visible than their coastal presence, the St. Lawrence River was a major highway for any culture based on maritime and riverine resources, and the junction of the Great River, the point where the river narrows and the current changes character, where navigation required knowledge and skill, would have been a place of significance for any culture that used the river as its primary transportation network. There is a site not far upriver from Quebec City, at a place called Pointe de Buisson near Melocheville, at the confluence of the Ottawa River with the St. Lawrence, where archaeological investigation has documented continuous human occupation from approximately 7,000 years ago to the period of European contact. The site shows the full sequence of cultures that used this stretch of the river, from the archaic through the woodland to the historic period, and it shows the river itself as a place of extraordinary importance, a place where peoples came together across great distances for trade and ceremony, a place where the concentration of resources drew people from a vast geographic range. The geology of Cap Diamant, its position at the narrows of the St. Lawrence, and the oral traditions about rooms within the rock all make more sense when you situate them within this longer picture of the St. Lawrence as a place of gathering, of ceremony, of the accumulation and preservation of important things. The red ochre in the northern recess of the chamber connects to this picture in a specific way. Ochre was not locally abundant in the Quebec City area. The iron-rich rocks that produce usable ochre are found in particular geological formations that are not present in the immediate vicinity of Cap Diamant. To have a substantial quantity of ochre in the chamber, that ochre had to be transported there, carried from wherever it was obtained to this specific underground location. That transport implies intent. It implies that someone decided that this place was important enough to bring a material of value to, a material that was used in the most significant and careful contexts of their cultural practice. The ochre in the northern recess is not incidental. It is a statement about what the space meant. The wall markings recorded by the archaeologist are a different kind of statement, and they have generated more interpretive debate among the scholars who have examined the sketches in the journal. The nested angular forms that the archaeologist drew are not unique to any single period or culture in northeastern North American archaeology. Similar forms appear on ceramic vessels from the Middle Woodland period, on worked bone from the late Archaic, on rock art sites across the Shield and the St. Lawrence Valley, and in various media across a very broad geographic range. This does not make them meaningless. It means they belong to a visual tradition that was widespread and long-standing, one of those fundamental geometric vocabularies that appears in human cultural expression across many contexts. But it does make it impossible, without much more detailed analysis of the sketches and ideally direct examination of the originals in the chamber, to assign them to a specific culture or period with any confidence. What can be said is that they are consistent with the pre-contact indigenous artistic traditions of northeastern North America, that they are the kind of thing that a skilled practitioner of those traditions would have produced on a surface intended for significant use, and that their presence in this underground space reinforces the interpretation of the chamber as a place of deliberate cultural practice rather than simply of practical use or natural occurrence. The second passage, at the far end of the chamber, the one that the expedition did not enter because they lacked the equipment for an extended investigation, is the element of the story that has generated the most speculation and the least concrete evidence. The geologist described being able to see into the passage for a short distance with his lantern before the angle of the fracture took it out of his line of sight. He saw a continuation of the passage, wider than the entry passage but narrower than the chamber, and he saw no obvious obstruction. The archaeologist's journal adds the observation that the opening to this second passage appeared to have received the same preparation as the entry passage, meaning that the natural fracture had been cleared and widened to permit human movement through it. Beyond that, neither man could say what lay further in, and no one, to the extent that the archival record permits a judgment, appears to have gone to look. This is the gap at the heart of the story. A chamber was found. A continuation was observed. The investigation stopped, and the question of what continuation might lead to has remained open for more than a century, sitting in the gap between what was found and what was followed up, in that particular kind of limbo that characterizes anomalous discoveries in places where institutional interest runs in a different direction from where the evidence points. The geographer's work in the early 2000s offers one piece of context for thinking about the second passage. His mapping of void spaces beneath the old city identified a cluster of records in the area above and to the east of the chamber location, in the zone where the cliff begins to rise toward the upper town. These records came from the construction of the fortifications of Quebec, which involved extensive cutting into and building on the rock of the promontory, and from the foundations of institutional buildings that were constructed on the heights in the 18th and 19th centuries. Several of these records described unexpected void spaces that were simply filled or bypassed during construction, and their spatial distribution, when plotted on the geographer's map, was consistent with the extension of a void network from the lower town up into the rock of the cliff itself. This is not proof that the second passage leads anywhere significant. Void networks in limestone can branch and terminate, can grow large in one section and taper to nothing in another, can connect to surface features or remain entirely internal to the rock, but it is consistent with the possibility that what the 1898 expedition found was not an isolated pocket, but part of a larger system, one whose extent and character would require serious investigation to determine. Quebec City has continued to build and develop and excavate over the more than a century since 1898. The construction of the modern city has created many opportunities for subsurface discoveries, and some of those opportunities have been documented with varying degrees of care. The archaeology of Quebec City has improved considerably since the early 20th century, and significant excavations in the historic district have revealed important information about the French colonial period and, in some cases, about the periods that preceded it. But the systematic investigation of the void spaces beneath the old city has not been a priority of that archaeological work, and the chamber described in the 1898 accounts has not been the subject of any organized modern investigation. The historian of science who examined the archaeologist's journal in the 1990s attempted to determine whether the entry point used by the 1898 expedition could be identified from the surviving descriptions. Her account of this effort is instructive. The descriptions in the journal and in the geologist's letters are specific enough to narrow the location to a particular block of the lower town, but not specific enough, given the extensive rebuilding that has occurred since 1898, to identify a specific building or address with certainty. The building through which the expedition entered was significantly modified or demolished and replaced at some point in the early 20th century, and the basement through which they descended has either been built over or transformed, to the point where the connection to the natural void system below is no longer apparent from above. She raised the possibility of locating the chamber from below rather than from above, using geophysical survey methods that were available by the 1990s, specifically ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography, which can detect subsurface void spaces from the surface without excavation. She noted that such methods had been applied successfully to the investigation of underground spaces in other urban historical contexts, including in European cities with extensive Roman and medieval underground infrastructure. She recommended that a pilot geophysical survey of the relevant block of the lower town had be conducted to determine whether the chamber described in the 1898 accounts could be located and its extent characterized. That recommendation was not acted upon in the 1990s. Her published paper on the Archaeologist's Journal, which appeared in a Canadian historical journal, attracted modest scholarly attention, but did not generate the kind of institutional response that would be needed to fund and organize a geophysical survey. The paper is cited occasionally in subsequent work on Quebec City archaeology and on the broader question of pre-contact archaeological sites in urban contexts, but it has not been the starting point for a follow-up investigation. This pattern of a careful scholar identifying a specific and testable hypothesis, recommending a specific and feasible investigation, and receiving no institutional response, is one that appears repeatedly in the history of anomalous pre-contact archaeological discoveries in North America. It is not unique to Quebec. It is not unique to Canada. It appears in the American Southwest, in the Great Plains, in the Pacific Northwest, in Australia, across the full range of places where the standard narrative of pre-contact Indigenous life has been challenged by physical evidence that does not fit the established interpretive framework. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how scholarly institutions allocate attention and resources, a feature that consistently disadvantages evidence that challenges established narratives in favor of evidence that confirms them, not through deliberate suppression, but through the invisible mechanism of what seems like an obviously worthwhile use of limited time and money. Let us return to the Wendat and the Algonquin, because the oral tradition dimension of this story is not just a supporting element that corroborates the archival evidence. It is an independent line of evidence with its own logic and its own implications, and it deserves to be examined on its own terms before being placed in relationship to the archival and geological record. The Wendat Nation, formerly known today as the Wyandot Nation of Kansas, the Wyandot Nation of Oklahoma, the Wyandot Nation of Andadon, and in Canada, the Huron-Wendat Nation based at Wendake, near Quebec City, has maintained a continuous tradition of its relationship to the land along the Street Lawrence. The community at Wendake, which is located within the agglomeration of Quebec City itself, has been there since the early 18th century, when the remnant Wendat community that had survived the upheavals of the 17th century settled in that location under the protection of the French colonial regime. They have been maintaining their traditions, their language, their ceremonial practices, and their knowledge of their ancestral territory from that location for 300 years. The Huron-Wendat Nation has been actively engaged in recent decades in the documentation and revitalization of their cultural heritage, including the oral traditions that constitute their historical knowledge. This work has produced several publications and a substantial body of community-held material that is not publicly available, but that has been discussed in general terms in academic and policy contexts. Among the traditions that this revitalization work has documented and worked to preserve is the tradition relating to the place of the narrowing river, to Cap Diamant, and to what the ground there holds. Indigenous scholars working with the Huron-Wendat Nation and with Algonquin communities have described this tradition in terms that are consistent with what the Jesuit relations and the 19th century ethnographic record recorded, but with the additional dimension that comes from working within the tradition rather than observing it from outside. The chamber, in the tradition as currently held by Huron-Wendat knowledge keepers, is associated with practices of preservation and with the activities of a specialized group of practitioners who maintain knowledge in forms and places that could survive periods of disruption. This framing of an underground space, used not just for ceremony but for the preservation of important knowledge through periods of upheaval, is one that echoes in the traditions of other cultures in other parts of the world, and that makes particular sense in the context of a society that experienced the profound disruptions of the 17th century and found itself fighting for cultural survival. The Algonquin perspective, documented separately through the work of scholars working with Algonquin communities in the Ottawa River Valley and the Lower St. Lawrence region, adds a different dimension. The Algonquin tradition about the place of the narrowing river is somewhat different from the Wendat tradition, reflecting the different relationship that semi-nomadic hunting and gathering peoples had with this stretch of river compared to the more sedentary Wendat horticulturalists. But both traditions share the element of the ground as holding something old, something made, something that belongs to a time before the oldest stories that anyone now living can remember. This temporal dimension, the reference to a time before the oldest remembered stories, is worth pausing on. In oral tradition research, such references are not treated as meaningless rhetorical inflation. They are treated as genuine temporal markers, as ways of situating knowledge in deep time that is beyond the reach of genealogical memory, but that the tradition nonetheless carries. The Klamath oral tradition about the formation of Crater Lake, confirmed by geological dating to be accurate to within a few hundred years of the actual event, 7,700 years ago, uses similar language that conveys extreme antiquity without providing a specific date. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that accurately describe coastlines submerged thousands of years ago use the same kind of language. These are not vague gestures toward a mythological past. They are the conventional way of communicating genuine historical depth in a culture that measures deep time by narrative means rather than by numerical chronology. The implication for the Quebec case is that the modification of the void spaces beneath Cap Diamant, if we take the oral tradition as a genuine historical claim rather than a merely spiritual one, began a very long time ago, possibly in the range of thousands of years before the period of European contact. This is not a claim that can currently be verified or refuted, because the verification would require direct dating of the work surfaces and the objects found in the chamber, and no such dating has been done. But it is a claim that is consistent with the geological and archaeological context, with the evidence for very long human presence in the St. Lawrence Valley, and with the traditions of cultures that are known to have had sophisticated relationships with the physical landscape and with the underground spaces that landscape contains. Quebec City is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its extraordinary preservation of the built heritage of New France and its colonial fortifications and urban fabric. This recognition is well deserved. The Upper Town and the fortifications that ring it represent one of the best preserved examples of colonial French urban planning in the world, and the concentration of 17th, 18th, and 19th century buildings in the historic district gives the city a character that is genuinely rare in North America. But the World Heritage designation and the historical narrative that underpins it focuses almost entirely on the period of European occupation. The pre-contact history of the site, the 12,000 years or more of human presence in this valley before the French arrived, is acknowledged in principle but explored in practice only at the margins of the city's official history. This is a pattern that appears across North American cities that sit on top of long Indigenous occupation sequences, and it reflects a particular way of understanding what history is and what it matters. If history begins with written records, then Quebec's history begins with Cartier in 1535 or with Champlain in 1608, and everything before that is archaeology at best or anthropology at worst, a kind of proto-history that lacks the documentation to make it real in the way that the colonial period is real. This framing has been challenged extensively and effectively in recent decades by Indigenous scholars and by historians who have worked to incorporate oral traditions and other non-documentary evidence into the historical record. But challenging the framing in academic discourse and changing it in the institutions that shape public understanding of places like Quebec City are two different things, and the second is a much slower process than the first. The story of the 1898 expedition is, at one level, a story about an incomplete investigation of a specific underground space. But at another level, it is a story about how the intellectual frameworks of any given period determine what can be seen and what cannot be seen, even when investigators are standing in the presence of the evidence. The men who went below Cap Diamant in 1898 were trained observers who reported carefully what they found. They were not incompetent or dishonest, but they worked within intellectual frameworks that had no place for what they were looking at, and the institutions that might have organized a follow-up investigation had no conceptual category into which to put a pre-contact indigenous underground chamber in northeastern North America, and so the follow-up never happened. We are in a different intellectual moment now. The frameworks for understanding pre-contact indigenous history in northeastern North America have been transformed in the past several decades by new archaeological discoveries, by the methodological revolution in ancient DNA analysis, by the serious incorporation of oral traditions as historical evidence, and by the growing involvement of indigenous nations themselves in the research programs that investigate their ancestors' history. The tools available for investigating underground spaces without excavating them, for dating materials and surfaces, for analyzing organic residues and pigments, have advanced enormously since 1898, and enormously since the 1990s when the historian of science first recommended a geophysical survey. What would a modern investigation of the chamber described in the 1898 accounts look like? The first step would be to locate it. Ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography, applied systematically to the relevant block of the lower town, would likely be able to detect a void space of the dimensions described in the 1898 accounts. These methods have been used successfully in many urban archaeological contexts, in Quebec City itself, for the investigation of colonial period structures, and in much more challenging subsurface conditions than would be expected here. The location of the chamber within the geological and built fabric of the lower town would then permit a more targeted investigation of whether and how access could be achieved. If access could be achieved, the investigation would focus on several specific questions. The character of the worked surfaces, their extent, and the techniques used to produce them would be one priority, both for understanding what was done here and for generating samples for radiometric dating. The contents of the northern recess, whatever remains of the objects placed there, would be another priority, with particular attention to dating the organic materials and characterizing the worked stone objects. The wall markings would be photographed systematically under multiple lighting conditions to capture detail that the archaeologists' 1,898 sketches could not capture. And the second passage, the one that the expedition did not enter, would be the most significant target of all because understanding where it leads, whether it connects to a larger network or terminates in the rock, would transform the interpretive possibilities from a single chamber to something considerably more complex. The most important single piece of new evidence that a modern investigation could produce would be a radiocarbon date or a series of radiocarbon dates from organic materials in the chamber. If the remains of worked wood and worked fibre described by the archaeologist in 1898 are still present in the northern recess, even in a severely degraded condition, they might yield datable carbon. Charcoal, if any was present from ancient use of fire in the space, would be even better for dating purposes. The question of when this space was made and when it was used is the most fundamental question because the answer would determine what interpretive framework is appropriate and what narrative this space fits into. If the dates came back in the range of the last few hundred years before European contact, the chamber would belong to the late woodland period tradition, consistent with the Wendat or their immediate predecessors, and the story would be one of an indigenous community maintaining a ceremonial underground space in their home territory until the disruptions of the 17th century removed them from it. This would be significant and historically important, but not fundamentally surprising given what is known about late woodland period cultural practices in northeastern North America. If the dates came back in the range of the middle or early woodland period, 1,000 to 2,500 years before the present, the story would become considerably more interesting because the woodland period in this region is one of considerable cultural complexity and long-distance connection, the era of the Hopewell interaction sphere that drew peoples and materials across an enormous geographic range, and that included the extraordinary achievements at Newark in Ohio, at Mound City, at the various sites where the scale and sophistication of pre-contact indigenous North American civilization is most dramatically apparent. And if the dates came back in the Archaic period range, 2,500 to 8,000 years before the present, The story would require a fundamental rethinking of what was possible in this region at what time, because the standard narrative of archaic period cultures in the northeastern Strait Lawrence region is one of relatively mobile groups, without the social organization to undertake projects of the kind that the chamber description implies. The maritime archaic, it is worth noting, does not entirely fit this standard narrative, even as it currently stands. Their burial sites, particularly the extraordinary site at Port-au-Choix in Newfoundland, show levels of cultural complexity and ceremonial elaboration that exceed what the simple mobile hunter-gatherer model would predict. An underground ceremonial chamber in their territory, along the major river corridor that they used, would extend, but not fundamentally contradict, what we already know about their capabilities. Port-au-Choix is a site on the northwestern coast of Newfoundland, and it deserves more attention in this context than it typically receives in the standard accounts of pre-Columbian North America. The site was excavated in the 1960s by a Newfoundland archaeologist named Elmer Harp, and what he found there was a large maritime archaic burial ground dating from roughly 5,500 to 3,500 years ago. The burials contained an extraordinary quantity of ochre, so much that the excavation area was stained red, and the grave goods were of a richness and variety that spoke to a sophisticated ceremonial tradition and a well-developed social structure. The objects included carved objects of bone and stone, amulets and ornaments, hunting and fishing equipment of high quality, and objects that appeared to be associated with specialized ritual practitioners, what Harp carefully described as shamanic paraphernalia. The maritime archaic people of Port-au-Choix were not simple foragers scratching out a marginal existence. They were skilled maritime hunters who pursued the great sea mammals of the North Atlantic, whose social organization was sophisticated enough to support the construction and maintenance of a large burial ground used over thousands of years, and whose ceremonial tradition was complex enough to require specialized practitioners with their own distinctive equipment. They operated across a vast maritime territory, their artifact styles appearing at sites from Labrador to New England, connected by the coastal and river highways of the northeastern coast. The St. Lawrence River was a natural extension of their coastal territory. The narrows at what is now Quebec City, where the river changes character and the cliff face marks the transition between the estuary and the riverine interior, would have been a significant geographical feature for any maritime-oriented culture, a place where navigation and knowledge and ceremony would naturally concentrate. The chamber in the limestone of Cap Diamant, if it is as old as the oldest end of the possible date range, might be part of the story of these people, part of the infrastructure of a maritime culture whose geographic reach we are only beginning to understand. This is speculative, let that be clear. It is speculation grounded in real evidence and real possibilities, but it goes beyond what the available documentation can confirm. The 1,898 accounts do not give enough detail to establish the date or the cultural affiliation of the chamber, and without a modern investigation that generates datable material and analyzable objects, the speculation cannot be resolved. But the geological setting is right, the oral tradition dimension is consistent, the construction era void records add independent corroboration, and the pattern of the 1,898 expeditions' findings is coherent in a way that accidental discovery or misinterpretation would struggle to produce. 3 trained observers with different specializations all reported seeing the same things, and what they reported is internally consistent with a space that was deliberately created or modified for cultural purposes by people who knew this landscape intimately and who used its underground character in ways that their successors retained knowledge of for centuries. Let us talk about the broader landscape of the St. Lawrence Valley in the pre-contact period, because the chamber beneath Cap Diamant does not exist in isolation. It exists within a geography that has a very long and very complex human history, and understanding that history provides context for understanding what kind of place this was and what kinds of things were done here. The St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes form the largest freshwater system in the world, and they have been a highway for human movement and exchange for as long as humans have been in this part of the continent. The earliest firm evidence of human presence in the region dates to the end of the last glacial maximum, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the retreat of the ice sheets opened the land to recolonization, and the first peoples moved north along the newly exposed landscapes, following the retreating ice and the plants and animals that moved with it. These early peoples were Paleo-Indians, related to the founding populations that had entered the Americas from Asia during the glacial maximum and who had spread across the continent with remarkable speed. The Quebec City area was glaciated during the last glacial maximum, buried under thousands of meters of ice, and it became available for human occupation only as the ice retreated. But the deglaciation of this part of the street, Lawrence Valley, was rapid, and by 10 to 11,000 years ago, the promontory of Cap Diamant was ice-free and accessible. The earliest human presence in the region dates to approximately 10,000 years ago, documented at several sites in the St. Lawrence Valley, and from that earliest presence, the human occupation of this landscape was continuous, growing more complex and more culturally elaborate through the successive periods of the archaic and woodland traditions. The archaic period in the street. Lawrence and Great Lakes region, roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, saw the development of increasingly complex regional cultures with sophisticated stone tool traditions, evidence of long-distance trade in valued raw materials, and the gradual elaboration of ceremonial practices that are documented primarily through burial evidence. The ground stone technology that produced the polished stone objects described in the 1898 chamber accounts was developed and refined through this long archaic period, and the ochre-associated burial practices that make sense of the northern recess contents are archaic period traditions that continued into the subsequent woodland period. The woodland period, roughly 3,000 years ago to the period of European contact, is the era in which the cultural traditions of the St. Lawrence region reached their maximum elaboration. The introduction of ceramics, the development of more intensive horticulture in the south of the region, the emergence of the Hopewellian exchange network that connected communities across an enormous geographic range, the construction of the earthwork monuments of the Ohio Valley that remain among the most impressive pre-contact constructions in the continent, and the development of the complex social and political structures that characterize the nations encountered by the earliest European explorers, all belong to this period. The Wendat Confederacy, as Cartier encountered it at Stadacona in 1535, was a mature expression of a cultural tradition that had been developing in this region for thousands of years. Within this long sequence of human presence and cultural development, the underground spaces of the limestone landscape along the St. Lawrence were not incidental features. Limestone caves and void spaces appear in the archaeological record of this region as places of special significance, places where evidence of deliberate human activity is found in contexts that suggest ceremonial rather than purely practical use. The distinction between ceremonial and practical may itself be a modern imposition on a cultural framework in which the two were not separated in the way our categories suggest. But for the purposes of understanding what the evidence shows, it is useful to note that the character of what was found in the 1898 chamber, the ochre, the worked stone objects, the wall markings, points towards significance beyond simple shelter or storage. The ochre, in particular, is a thread that runs through the entire pre-contact history of northeastern North America in ways that make it one of the most consistent and widely distributed markers of human cultural activity in the Marcas region. Red ochre appears at the earliest human occupation sites in the continent. It appears in the elaborate burial traditions of the maritime archaic. It appears in Hopewell burial mounds 1,000 miles to the southwest. It appears in the grave goods of late woodland period burials across the region. Its presence in any underground space is never neutral. It indicates that the space was considered significant in ways that the people who used it expressed through the application of the most symbolically charged material in their cultural repertoire. The works of the early 20th century ethnographer Frank Speck, who spent decades documenting the cultures of Eastern Algonquian peoples, include several passages that relate to the use of underground spaces and to the significance of ochre in Algonquian ceremonial contexts. Speck was working with communities that were already significantly changed from their pre-contact forms, communities that had been through centuries of colonial pressure and cultural disruption, but he was meticulous in his documentation and careful in his interpretation. His accounts of the continuing significance of ochre in ceremonial contexts and of the oral traditions relating to underground spaces of significance, form one of the threads that connects the ethnographic record of the historic period to the pre-contact archaeological evidence. The implications of this thread for the Quebec case are suggestive rather than conclusive. The Algonquin peoples who used the area around Cap Diamant and who were among the communities that Champlain encountered when he established his settlement there in 1608 maintained traditions about the significance of the underground spaces in the cliff, and those traditions, documented fragmentarily in the Jesuit relations and more systematically in later ethnographic work, are consistent with the Wendat traditions and with the evidence from the 1898 expedition, two different cultural traditions, Algonquin and Wendat, both pointing to the same physical location and both describing it in terms that emphasize its underground character and its deep antiquity, constitute a convergence that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The 17th century was, for the peoples of the northeastern woodlands, a period of catastrophic disruption on a scale that is difficult to convey. Epidemic diseases, introduced by European contact before sustained European settlement, swept through communities that had no immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, and a range of other pathogens that they had never encountered. The epidemiological evidence, assembled from a combination of Jesuit mission records, demographic reconstruction from archaeological data, and comparative analysis of disease impact in documented historical cases, suggests that the indigenous population of northeastern North America declined by somewhere between 50 and 90% in the century and a half following first sustained European contact. This is not history in the sense of events that happened to distant peoples long ago. This is a demographic catastrophe of a scale that has no parallel in the documented history of the hemisphere, a loss of life and knowledge and cultural continuity that transformed the indigenous world of northeastern North America in ways from which it has not fully recovered. When the Wendat at Stadacona disappeared between 1535 and 1608, they disappeared into this catastrophe. When the survivors of the Wendat Confederacy fled south and east in 1649 and 1650, driven from their Georgian Bay homeland by Haudenosaunee raids in a period of extraordinary violence and dislocation, they carried with them the fragments of a knowledge tradition that had been developed over thousands of years but had been partially lost to epidemic mortality and partially driven underground by colonial cultural pressure. What they carried, including the knowledge of rooms within the rock at the place of the narrowing river, was preserved because it was important enough to preserve, because the people who held it understood that it might be needed again, that the disruptions of their century were not the end of their existence as a people, but a crisis that required the safeguarding of what was most essential. The underground chamber of the oral tradition, in this framing, becomes not just a historical artifact but a kind of cultural survival mechanism, a place associated with the preservation of knowledge and practice through periods of catastrophe. This is not a new idea in the study of underground spaces across cultures worldwide. The use of caves and subterranean spaces for the preservation of important cultural material in periods of crisis or disruption appears across human history in many different contexts. The Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved in caves. The painted caves of Europe preserved cultural traditions for tens of thousands of years. The sacred kiva chambers of the Pueblo peoples, partly underground and protected from the casual view of outsiders, served as repositories of ceremonial knowledge through periods of colonial pressure and cultural disruption. The idea that the peoples of the Street, Lawrence Valley might have used underground spaces in a similar way, that they might have understood the preservation properties of the underground environment and used them deliberately, is not exotic. It is entirely consistent with what human beings have done in other places and other times. The kiva comparison is worth extending a little because the kiva tradition of the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest is one of the better documented examples of the use of semi-subterranean spaces for ceremonial purposes in North America, and some of its features are directly relevant to thinking about what the chamber beneath Cap Diamant might have been. Kivas are partially or fully underground chambers constructed within or adjacent to Pueblo communities, used for ceremonial gatherings, for the transmission of esoteric knowledge, and for the maintenance of the community's relationship with the forces and beings of the underground world. They are not caves in the natural sense. They are constructed chambers, but they incorporate the fundamental symbolic dimension of being below ground, of being in the earth rather than on it. The ancestral Puebloan tradition of kiva construction extends back at least 2,000 years and possibly considerably further, and the kiva, as an architectural form, persists to the present day in Pueblo communities across New Mexico and Arizona. The endurance of this tradition through 2,000 years of cultural change and colonial pressure is testimony to the depth of its significance. The kiva is not a peripheral element of Pueblo culture. It is central to it, a place where the most important work of cultural reproduction happens, where knowledge is transmitted, where the community's relationship with its ancestors and with the powers of the world is maintained. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant, as described in the 1898 accounts, shares several features with the kiva tradition. It is underground. It shows evidence of deliberate modification of a natural space to make it more suitable for human use. It contains ochre, a ceremonially significant material, and it appears to have been a place where specific objects of cultural importance were kept. The wall markings suggest that it was a place where cultural knowledge was inscribed in a durable medium, where the act of marking the walls was part of the practice associated with the space. The second passage, leading deeper into the rock, is consistent with the kiva tradition of multiple levels of significance, of spaces within spaces, each with its own character and function. None of this constitutes proof that the chamber was a kiva in the specific Pueblo sense. The Pueblo tradition and the northeastern woodland traditions are separated by geography, by cultural history, and by the deep divergences of 2,000 years of separate development from their common archaic period roots. But the shared elements point toward a more general principle, that underground spaces have served as places of cultural significance across a wide range of North American cultures, and that the presence of such a space beneath the oldest occupied promontory in northeastern North America is entirely consistent with the broader pattern of how indigenous peoples in this hemisphere have related to the underground dimensions of their landscapes. Let us turn now to the colonial period and to what that period's construction and modification of Cap Diamant may have preserved or destroyed of the older underground infrastructure. The French colonial period at Quebec City began in earnest with Champlain's settlement in 1608, and within a few decades, the site was being developed as the capital of New France, with increasingly substantial and permanent construction. The construction of the Château Saint-Louis on the cliff top, the expansion of the fortifications, the development of the lower town at the foot of the cliff, all required extensive cutting into and building on the rock of the promontory. The fortifications that ring Quebec City, which are the most extensively preserved colonial fortifications in North America, were built and repeatedly modified over a period of more than 2 centuries, from the late 17th century through the British colonial period and into the 19th century. The construction of these fortifications required the cutting of ditches, the excavation of batteries and casemates, and the drilling and blasting of the rock to create defensive features. This work inevitably intersected with the natural void system beneath the promontory, and the accounts of the military engineers who oversaw this construction include numerous references to unexpected subsurface features, to voids that opened up during excavation, to passages that led in directions that the engineers had not anticipated. These engineering accounts are preserved in the records of the Royal Engineers and their French predecessors, and they constitute another archival thread that bears on the question of what is beneath Cap Diamant. The geographer who mapped the void spaces in the early 2000s examined a portion of these engineering records and found several entries that described encountered features in terms that suggested human modification rather than purely natural formation. Walls that were too regular, floors that were too level, passages that were too directional to be the product of dissolution alone. These entries appear in the margins of engineering reports whose primary concern was the stability of the fortifications above, and they were noted without follow-up, because follow-up was not part of the engineering task. The accidental discovery pattern that the geographer documented for the civilian construction of the lower town thus appears also in the military construction of the upper town and the fortifications, suggesting that the void network, if it is a network, extends through the rock of the entire promontory rather than being confined to the area of the lower town where the 1,000 100898 expedition entered. This is geologically plausible, given the character of the limestone and the way that karst systems develop. It is also consistent with the Wendat oral tradition, which does not locate the rooms within the rock in any single precise spot, but describes them in terms of the promontory as a whole, as a feature of the place rather than of any particular accessible point within it. The British military period at Quebec, beginning after the fall of the city in 1759 and continuing through the 19th century, added another layer of construction to the promontory, and the British engineering records, which are somewhat more systematic than their French predecessors, add another layer of documentation to the pattern of unexpected subsurface discoveries. The historian of science, who examined the archaeologist's journal, also examined a selection of the British engineering records and found consistent references to void spaces encountered during construction that were described as having surfaces inconsistent with purely natural formation. One entry in particular, from the early 19th century, describes a void encountered during the construction of a powder magazine that had a floor surface that the supervising engineer characterized as too level and too smooth to be natural, combined with a deposit of a red mineral powder that he identified without apparent uncertainty as iron oxide. The engineer's response to this discovery was entirely practical. He had the void filled with rubble to ensure the stability of the magazine above. There was no suggestion in his report that the discovery was of any particular interest beyond the engineering problem it presented. From the perspective of 1820, a void with a red mineral deposit in the rock beneath a fortification was simply a construction problem, not an archaeological discovery. The engineer's description of the red mineral powder as iron oxide, which is ochre, is the closest parallel in the colonial-era engineering records to the ochre described by the 1898 expedition in the northern recess of the chamber. It is not the same location. The powder magazine site is in the upper town, while the 1898 entry was in the lower town. But it suggests that the ochre-associated use of underground spaces was not confined to a single chamber, but extended to multiple locations within the limestone of Cap Diamant, consistent with the interpretation of a network of spaces rather than a single isolated feature. This is the accumulative character of the evidence for what happened beneath Quebec City before the French arrived. No single piece of evidence is conclusive. Each piece can be explained away individually. The engineering records are imprecise, the oral traditions are ambiguous, the 1898 accounts are frustratingly incomplete. But the accumulation of independent lines of evidence, each point just in the same direction, each consistent with the others, produces a pattern that is much more difficult to dismiss than any single element. Geologists, engineers, archaeologists, oral tradition documenters, and ethnographers working across 2 centuries and with no coordination between them have all reported findings consistent with a network of underground spaces beneath Cap Diamant that show evidence of sustained human use over a very long period. The probability that this convergence is coincidental decreases with each independent corroboration. The question of why this has not been more seriously investigated in the modern period requires a frank assessment of the institutional and intellectual conditions that have shaped Canadian archaeology and Canadian public history. Canadian archaeology as a professional discipline developed primarily in the 20th century, drawing on frameworks established in Britain and the United States, and it has been shaped by the same disciplinary boundaries and institutional priorities that have characterized archaeology in those countries. The division between archaeologists who study the pre-contact period and historians who study the post-contact period is a real boundary with real institutional consequences, and it means that the evidence from the colonial-era engineering records, which belongs to the historian's domain, has rarely been in productive conversation with the evidence from oral traditions or from the 1898 expedition accounts, which belong to the archaeologist's domain. The treatment of Indigenous oral traditions as historical evidence has improved considerably in Canadian scholarly and legal contexts over the past few decades, driven partly by the increasing recognition of Indigenous rights in Canadian law, and partly by the growing body of research demonstrating the empirical accuracy of specific tradition content. The Supreme Court of Canada's recognition, in a series of decisions beginning in the 1990s, of oral histories as admissible evidence of territorial use and occupation has had an effect on how oral traditions are treated in academic contexts as well, though the effect has been uneven and contested. Within Quebec specifically, the question of pre-contact history has an additional complexity that reflects the particular character of Quebec's historical and cultural self-understanding. Quebec's identity as a distinct society within Canada has historically been articulated primarily in terms of French language and culture, of the Catholicism that shaped the colonial period, and of the political and cultural history of New France and its descendants. The pre-contact Indigenous history of the territory has been less central to this self-understanding, and the relationship between the Quebec state and Indigenous nations within its territory has been marked by tensions that complicate straightforward collaborative research programs of the kind that would be needed to properly investigate. The chamber described in the 1898 accounts. The Huron-Wendat nation at Wendake has a particular and complex relationship to Quebec City and to the site of Cap Diamant. They have been in that location for 300 years. Their territory and their history are woven into the city's history in ways that are only partially acknowledged in the official narrative. The active engagement of the Huron-Wendat nation in any investigation of the underground spaces of Cap Diamant would not simply be a matter of courtesy or of legal compliance with Indigenous consultation requirements. It would be an epistemological necessity, because the oral tradition knowledge held by the nation is one of the primary evidence threads pointing toward the chamber's existence and significance, and any investigation that did not incorporate that knowledge as a central input rather than a peripheral consideration would be epistemologically deficient in the most literal sense. It would be missing crucial data. The model for what such a collaborative investigation might look like is not entirely hypothetical. In other parts of Canada, and in other countries with similar histories of colonial disruption of Indigenous knowledge systems, collaborative research programs have been developed that bring together Indigenous knowledge holders, geologists, archaeologists, and historians in frameworks that treat all of these forms of knowledge as legitimate evidence and that give Indigenous communities a meaningful role in the design and direction of the research, rather than simply the consultation that is legally required. The Budgebim cultural landscape in Victoria, Australia, where the Gunditjmara nation's oral tradition about their aquaculture system contributed directly to the archaeological investigation that confirmed the system's age at 6,600 years, is one model. The collaborative research program at Crater Lake in Oregon, where Klamath tribal representatives worked alongside USGS and university researchers in a program that explicitly treated the oral tradition as a source of research hypotheses and tested those hypotheses using geophysical methods, is another. In both cases, the collaborative framework produced research results that would not have been produced by standard disciplinary methods alone, because the oral tradition knowledge provided geographical precision and theoretical framing that the scientific methods could then test. This is the potential of the collaborative approach, not that Indigenous knowledge and scientific methods produce the same results through different means, but that they are genuinely complementary, that each can do things the other cannot, and that together they can investigate questions that neither could approach alone. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant is exactly the kind of question that requires this approach. The geophysical methods can locate the void space and characterize its dimensions and its relationship to the surrounding rock. The archaeological methods, carefully applied, can recover and analyze the materials within the space and generate the dates and identifications needed to understand when and how it was used. The geological methods can establish the natural history of the void formation and separate the natural from the anthropogenic modification, and the oral tradition knowledge can guide all of these methods, can provide the geographical specificity and the interpretive context that gives the physical evidence meaning, can say this is what we always said was here, and the instruments can confirm, extend, and refine that knowledge in ways that no amount of oral transmission alone can achieve. This is the conversation that has not yet happened in Quebec City, or has not happened yet in the form that the evidence and the institutional possibilities now permit. The evidence has been accumulating for more than a century, in the archival records, in the engineering reports, in the oral traditions, in the scattered scholarly work of historians and geographers and ethnographers who have touched different parts of the story without bringing them together into a single coherent investigation. The tools for the investigation that is needed have been available for decades. The legal and ethical frameworks for Indigenous collaborative research have been developed and refined. The institutional barriers are real, but they are not insurmountable. There is something worth noting about the broader pattern of how pre-contact underground spaces have been treated in the scholarship and public discourse of Canada and the United States, because the Quebec case is not unique in the sense of being isolated. It belongs to a pattern that extends across the continent, a pattern in which evidence for underground spaces of human modification in pre-contact contexts appears, is noted, is not followed up, and accumulates in archival records and scholarly margins, while the standard narrative of pre-contact Indigenous life continues largely unchanged. The souterrain tradition of Atlantic Celtic Europe provides one relevant comparison. Souterrains are underground passages and chambers, found in large numbers in Scotland, Ireland, and Brittany, associated with Iron Age and early medieval period communities who used them for various purposes including storage, shelter, and possibly ceremonial activities. More than 2,000 souterrains have been documented in Scotland alone, and several hundred more in Ireland. They are not mysteries, they are well-documented archaeological features of the Atlantic Celtic cultural tradition. But the existence of a well-documented underground construction tradition in Atlantic Celtic Europe raises the obvious question of whether there are analogous features in the areas of North America that were reached by the Atlantic. Coastal peoples in the pre-contact period reached not through transoceanic contact in the speculative sense, but through the known and documented coastal migration routes that brought the first peoples to northeastern North America from the south, and that maintained connections between communities along the Atlantic coast for thousands of years. The maritime archaic tradition, which used the coastal and river systems of the northwestern Atlantic in the same way that the Atlantic Celtic tradition used the coastal and river systems of the northeastern Atlantic, developed over a comparable time span and in comparable ecological settings. The sophistication of maritime archaic ceremonial practice, demonstrated at Porto Shore and at several other burial sites along the northeastern coast, is not comparable to the souterrain building cultures of Celtic Europe in the simple sense of being equivalent, but it is comparable in the relevant sense of representing a cultural complexity capable of undertaking deliberate underground construction for purposes beyond simple practical shelter. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant, placed in this broader context, represents one data point in a continent-wide pattern of underground cultural activity that the standard archaeological narrative has systematically underestimated, not through deliberate falsification, but through the accumulated effect of disciplinary frameworks that direct attention toward what fits the established model and away from what does not. Souterrains in Scotland, well documented and studied. Underground spaces in the limestone of the Street, Lawrence Valley that show evidence of human modification, encountered repeatedly in construction records across 2 centuries, examined once in 1898, in limited form, and then essentially invisible in the scholarly literature, until a handful of researchers working in the 1990s and 2000s began to pull the threads together. There is a specific archival thread in the Quebec case that deserves more attention than it has received, and that is the record of the Quebec Literary and Historical Society itself, the institution that published the brief and uninformative notice about the 1898 expedition. And that was the primary learned society in Quebec City for much of the 19th and early 20th century. The society's records, held in their archive in Quebec City, include not just the published proceedings, but the manuscript records of meetings, correspondence between members, and unpublished papers that were read at meetings but never formally published. A researcher who worked through a portion of these records in the 2000s found several documents relating to the 1898 expedition that had not been examined by the historian of science who produced the primary scholarly account. These documents included a letter from one of the expedition participants to the Society's president, describing the findings in somewhat more detail than the private correspondence that had previously been examined, and minutes from a Society meeting at which the expedition was discussed, but at which no decision was taken about whether to pursue further investigation. The minutes of this meeting record that several members expressed interest in a follow-up expedition, but that concerns were raised about the potential implications of such an investigation for the city's construction plans in the relevant area of the lower town, an area that was undergoing significant development pressure at the time. This is an interesting detail. The concern about development implications suggests that the significance of the chamber was understood at some level by the society members who discussed it, that they recognized that a serious archaeological investigation might complicate or delay development plans for the lower town, and that this was a factor in the decision not to pursue further investigation. This is not suppression in the active sense, but it is the application of practical considerations to a decision about whether to pursue evidence that might be inconvenient, and it is recognizable as a pattern that recurs in the history of archaeological discoveries that have complicated or been complicated by development pressure. The letter from the expedition participant to the Society's president adds several details that are not present in the private correspondence previously examined. It describes the wall markings as covering a larger area of the eastern wall than the archaeologist's journal suggests, extending from near the floor to above head height across a stretch of several meters. It adds the observation that some of the markings appeared to have been made with a different instrument or technique from others, suggesting that they were not all the product of a single event, but had accumulated over time, different people or different periods adding to the record on the wall. This detail of accumulated marking over time is consistent with a space that was used repeatedly and possibly by multiple generations of practitioners, a place that was returned to and added to rather than used once and then sealed. The letter also adds a detail about the smell of the chamber that is not recorded elsewhere. The geologist noted a faint smell of something organic, something that he associated with plant material, that he thought might be from the remains of preserved organic objects in the northern recess. Organic preservation in underground limestone environments is variable and dependent on temperature, humidity, and the presence of salt minerals that can stabilize organic material against decomposition and the cool. The stable conditions of a limestone void can in some circumstances preserve organic materials for very long periods. If the worked wood and worked fiber described by the archaeologist in 1898 were preserved under such conditions, they might still be present and recoverable today, which would make the northern recess one of the most potentially informative targets of any future investigation. The preservation potential of the northern recess is worth dwelling on for a moment because it represents one of the most compelling practical arguments for conducting the investigation that has never happened. If the organic materials described in 1898 survive in a condition that permits radiocarbon dating, the question of the chamber's age could be answered directly and conclusively. If they survive in a condition that permits identification of the plant or animal species involved, that information would constrain the cultural context. If any residues of the ochre or of the plant materials show sufficient molecular preservation, ancient DNA analysis might be possible from material in the chamber, potentially revealing the genetic identity of the people who used it. The preservation conditions of limestone underground environments are variable, but often better than surface conditions, particularly for materials that have been protected from temperature fluctuation, from light, and from the mechanical disturbance that surface sites are subject to. Some of the best preserved organic material from pre-contact North America has come from underground contexts, from dry caves in the arid southwest to limestone caves in the humid northeast. The chamber described in the 1898 accounts, if its conditions have remained stable over the intervening century, represents an opportunity for the recovery of materials that could not be recovered from any surface site in the region. This is the argument for the investigation in its most concrete form. It is not an argument based on mystery or speculation, though the mystery and the speculation are genuinely interesting. It is an argument based on the straightforward observation that there is potentially important physical evidence sitting in a known location, that the methods for recovering and analyzing it exist and have been applied successfully in comparable contexts, and that the investigation has simply not been conducted because no institution has made it a priority. The evidence that prompted the 1898 expedition has grown more compelling since then, not less, because the additional threads of oral tradition documentation, engineering records, and geophysical context have been added to the original archival core. The case for investigation is stronger now than it was when the historian of science made her recommendation in the 1990s, and it will continue to be stronger the more thoroughly the existing evidence is assembled and assessed. Let us think now about what the chamber might ultimately mean if the investigation is conducted and if the findings confirm what the accumulation of evidence suggests. The meaning operates at several levels, and it is worth distinguishing them from each other. At the most immediate level, a confirmed pre-contact underground chamber in the limestone of Cap Diamant, with evidence of sustained use over a period that extends well back before European contact, would be an important archaeological discovery in its own right. It would expand what is known about the use of underground spaces in pre-contact northeastern North American cultures. It would add to the growing body of evidence for the sophistication and complexity of those cultures that standard educational narratives have consistently underrepresented. It would be a discovery worthy of publication, of public presentation, of incorporation into the interpretation of one of Canada's most visited historical sites. At a deeper level, the chamber and its story raise questions about the relationship between knowledge and institutional readiness to receive it, questions that are not specific to Quebec or to pre-contact archaeology but that appear in many domains of inquiry. The 1898 expedition found something that its intellectual context could not fully process, and the result was not denial or suppression but inaction, the most common and in some ways the most consequential response to evidence that does not fit established frameworks. Inaction is not neutral. In this case, it meant that more than a century of construction and development in Quebec City proceeded without the knowledge that would have informed different decisions about what lay beneath the ground, without the scientific analysis that would have established dates and contexts, and without the conversation between Indigenous knowledge and modern instruments that might have produced a much richer understanding of the site's pre-contact history. The cost of this inaction is not merely academic. The Huron-Wendat nation at Wendake has been maintaining its traditions about the significance of the underground spaces of Cap Diamant for centuries, in a context where those traditions were devalued and dismissed by the institutional frameworks of successive colonial regimes. The recognition that those traditions contain accurate geographical and historical information, which is what a successful investigation would provide, would be not just a scholarly finding, but a form of acknowledgement that the knowledge systems of the Wendat and their ancestors were functioning scientific instruments, tools for the observation and transmission of empirical information about the physical world, tools that deserve the same respect and the same engagement as the instruments of the geophysicist and the archaeologist. This is the epistemological dimension of the story, and it matters beyond the specific case of Quebec City. The broader question of whether oral traditions constitute a form of scientific knowledge, whether they encode empirical observations about the natural world in ways that are reliable and transmissible across time, has been asked and answered in the affirmative in a growing body of research across multiple disciplines and multiple continents. The Aboriginal Australian traditions about submerged coastlines, the Klamath tradition about Crater Lake, the Pacific Islander navigation traditions, the Inuit knowledge of sea ice conditions that is now being incorporated into climate science. These are not peripheral curiosities. They are demonstrations of a fundamental point about how knowledge works in human communities over long timescales. Oral traditions survive because they are useful, because the knowledge they contain matters for the survival and flourishing of the communities that maintain them. The Wendat tradition about the rooms within the rock survived the catastrophe of the 17th century, survived the removals and disruptions of the colonial period, survived the pressures of assimilation and cultural suppression because it was important enough to preserve. That importance is itself evidence of something. Things that are important enough to preserve across centuries of disruption are generally important because they are true, because they describe something real about the world that the community needs to know. There is a navigational dimension to the Quebec case that has not been fully explored in the existing scholarly literature, but that is suggested by the geography of Cap Diamant and by what is known about the role of landmark features. In pre-contact navigation along the St. Lawrence, the St. Lawrence Narrows at Quebec City is one of the most significant navigational features of the entire river system. For any culture moving along the river by water, this point required knowledge and attention. The current changes, the channel narrows, the tides from the estuary mix with the fresh water of the river interior in ways that create complex and sometimes dangerous water conditions. Making the passage safely required detailed knowledge of the local hydrography, knowledge that was accumulated and transmitted by generations of people who used this stretch of the river. Navigational knowledge in pre-contact cultures was not typically kept in books or charts, because books and charts did not exist. It was kept in the memories of experienced river travelers, encoded in oral traditions that associated specific landmarks with specific navigational information, maintained through the transmission of accumulated practical experience from generation to generation. The physical features of the landscape were the mnemonic structure on which the navigational knowledge was hung. Cap Diamant, the most dramatic feature of the Quebec City Narrows, with its cliff face rising nearly 100 meters above the river, and its distinctive silhouette visible from a great distance in both directions on the river, would naturally be the landmark most heavily laden with navigational information for any culture that used the St. Lawrence. If the underground spaces of Cap Diamant were associated with ceremony and with the transmission of important knowledge, they may also have been associated with the navigational knowledge that was essential for safe passage through the Narrows. The idea that important practical knowledge about the river was preserved and transmitted at this location, in association with ceremonial practices that gave the knowledge weight and protected its accuracy through the rigors of oral transmission, is consistent with what we know about how oral traditions work in navigational cultures worldwide. The sacred and the practical were not separated in the same way that modern culture separates them. The ceremony was the mechanism by which practical knowledge was guaranteed to be preserved and transmitted correctly. This would give the chamber beneath Cap Diamant a specifically navigational significance, making it not just a ceremonial space in the abstract, but a place where the knowledge needed to use the river safely was maintained across generations. This is speculative, but it is grounded in the geography of the site and in the functional logic of how oral traditions encode practical information in ceremonially significant forms. It is the kind of speculation that a properly designed investigation, in collaboration with Wendat and Algonquin knowledge holders, might be able to assess against the evidence that the chamber itself contains. The St. Lawrence River was the economic and cultural highway of northeastern North America in the pre-contact period, and understanding the full complexity of its role requires understanding not just the river itself, but the network of social and cultural relationships that made it function as more than a geographical feature. Rivers do not become highways by themselves. They become highways because people develop the knowledge, the technology, and the social institutions needed to use them as such. The St. Lawrence became the great highway of northeastern North America because successive cultures developed and refined the knowledge and technology of riverine navigation, built the social networks of relationship and obligation that made long-distance travel safe, and maintained the ceremonial and institutional frameworks that preserved and transmitted this accumulated capability across generations. Cap Diamant, at the Narrows of the Great River, was in this context a place of enormous strategic and ceremonial significance. It was the point where the estuary became the river, where the saltwater gave way to fresh, where navigation required a shift of knowledge and technique, where traders and hunters and diplomats moving up and down the river had to know exactly what they were doing. It was the kind of place where the accumulated knowledge of a culture is most densely concentrated, where the most important people stop to perform the most important ceremonies, where the things that need to be preserved most carefully are kept. The underground spaces of limestone, cool and stable and dark, were the natural repositories for such preservation. Not natural in the sense of occurring without human intention, but natural in the sense of fitting perfectly into the logic of what a culture that understood the properties of underground limestone environments would choose for the preservation of materials and knowledge that needed to last. The ochre in the northern recess, the work stone objects, the organic material that the geologist smelled when he stood in the chamber in 1898, the wall markings that the archaeologist sketched, all of these are consistent with a place where things were deliberately brought and deliberately kept, where the underground environment was chosen precisely because of its preserving qualities, where the darkness and the cold and the stability of the rock were understood and used. This is the kind of knowledge that comes from very long experience of a landscape. You do not learn the preserving properties of underground limestone from a short acquaintance with the rock. You learn it over generations, as a tradition that is built up incrementally through the observation of what survives and what does not, through the experience of materials kept in underground spaces, persisting while comparable materials kept above ground decay. The cultures that use the underground spaces of Cap Diamant for preservation purposes, whatever their specific identity and whatever the specific period of their most intensive use of the space, had been in relationship with this landscape for a very long time. Let us address, directly and honestly, the limitations of what is known and what can be claimed from the evidence as it stands. The 1898 expedition was limited in its scope, and the accounts it produced are fragmentary. The geologist's private letters describe what he observed with care, but not with the precision that a modern site report would require. The archaeologist's journal is more detailed, but still lacks the systematic documentation that modern archaeology demands. Neither account includes measurements taken with instruments, because the expedition did not bring instruments. Neither includes photographs, because while photography existed in 1898, bringing camera equipment into an underground space was not a practical possibility for a small and informally organized expedition with lanterns for light. The objects described in the northern recess were not collected, not measured, not photographed. The wall markings were copied by hand in a format that is better than nothing but that lacks the fidelity of photographic documentation. The second passage was observed at a glance and not entered. The sediment on the floor was described but not sampled. The work's surfaces were noted but not characterized in the detailed way that a modern geological analysis would require. This is the limitation of the archive. It tells us that something was found, and it tells us in general terms what that something was, but it does not give us the data that would permit confident conclusions about age, cultural affiliation, or the full extent of the feature. The constructive response to this limitation is not to dismiss the evidence as insufficient for any conclusion, but to treat it as the foundation for an investigation that generates the data that is currently lacking. The archive tells us where to look and what to look for. The investigation would tell us what is actually there. The oral traditions are not limited in the same way, but they are limited in different ways. They provide geographical specificity and temporal framing, but they do not provide the kind of detail that would permit precise characterization of the chamber's contents or age. They are consistent with the 1898 accounts and with the geological and engineering records, and this consistency across independent lines of evidence is meaningful. But consistency is not proof, and the oral traditions cannot substitute for the physical investigation that would answer the questions of age and content definitively. The honest position, given the evidence as it stands, is that there is a substantial body of consistent evidence for the existence of a pre-contact underground chamber or network of chambers beneath Cap Diamant, evidence from multiple independent sources that the chamber, as described, is consistent with the geological character of the site and with what is known about the use of underground spaces in pre-contact northeastern North American cultures, and that the evidence merits the serious investigation that has not yet been conducted. It is not the honest position to claim more than this, to say that the evidence proves the existence of an ancient and sophisticated underground civilization, or to make specific claims about the cultural identity or age of the chamber's users that the evidence does not support. The Geological Survey of Canada, which was the institution primarily involved in the 1898 expedition, has changed substantially over the past century. It continues to conduct geological investigations across the country, and its work in the St. Lawrence Valley has included the mapping of karst features and underground void spaces in the region. The survey's modern publications on the geology of the Quebec City area acknowledge the karstic character of the Cap Diamant promontory and note the presence of underground voids without discussing the possibility of human modification or investigating it systematically. The Bureau of Archaeology and Prehistory within Parks Canada, which has responsibility for archaeological research at national historic sites, including the historic district of Quebec City, has conducted significant archaeological work in the Upper Town and in the fortifications, producing important results about the colonial period occupation of the site. the pre-contact period has received less systematic attention, in part because the preservation conditions for above-ground pre-contact features are poor in an area that has been continuously occupied and built over for 4 centuries. A collaboration between the Geological Survey, Parks Canada Archaeology, the Huron-Wendat Nation, and the Algonquin Nation focused specifically on the subsurface geology and pre-contact archaeology of Cap Diamant would be the combination of institutional and community participation needed to properly investigate the question that the 1898 expedition raised and never fully answered. The institutional elements exist. The community partnerships are the crucial addition, because they bring not just the legal requirement for consultation, but the epistemological resource of the oral tradition knowledge, the most direct and specific evidence of what the underground spaces of Cap Diamant were and what they meant. Whether such a collaboration will be organized is a question that cannot be answered from the present. The institutional inertia that has allowed more than a century to pass since the 1898 expedition without a follow-up investigation is real and not trivially overcome. But the conditions for such a collaboration are more favorable now than they have been at any previous time, because the legal frameworks for Indigenous participation in research about their ancestral territories are stronger, because the scientific methods for non-invasive subsurface investigation are more powerful, because the scholarly frameworks for treating oral traditions as evidence are more developed, and because the broader public interest in the full and honest history of pre-contact North America has grown substantially. Quebec City presents its history to its visitors with considerable skill and attention. The historic district is beautifully preserved, carefully interpreted, and genuinely informative about the French colonial and British colonial periods that shaped the city. The fortifications are explained in detail. The major buildings are documented and accessible. The history of New France, with its remarkable cast of characters, its drama of survival and adaptation and imperial ambition, is told with care and some sophistication. The Château Frontenac stands on the cliff above the river as an emblem of the city's confidence in its own historical grandeur, and the grandeur is real, earned by a genuinely extraordinary history. But 12,000 years or more of human history before Samuel de Champlain arrived at the narrows of the street, Lawrence, in 1608, are present in that interpretation primarily as background, as context, as the setting into which the colonial drama was inserted. The Wendat people who lived at Stadacona are named. Cartier's encounters with them are described. The epidemiological catastrophe that removed them from the site before Champlain arrived is acknowledged. But the depth of pre-contact history at the site, the 12 millennia of human presence that preceded the brief period of recorded history, is not a central part of the story that Quebec City tells about itself. This is a choice. It is not an inevitable feature of how history works or how historical sites are interpreted. The choice to foreground colonial history and background pre-contact history is made in the allocation of interpretive resources, in the framing of the narrative, in the decision about what questions to ask and what evidence to pursue. A different choice would produce a different history, one that treated the 12,000 years of pre-contact human activity at this remarkable geographical location as equally central to the story, equally worthy of investigation and interpretation, equally important for understanding what this place has been and what it means. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant, if it exists in the form that the evidence suggests, is precisely the kind of discovery that could shift this choice. It is physically located beneath the most visited historical site in Canada, in a city that has built its identity on its historical depth and authenticity. The discovery of a well-preserved pre-contact underground space beneath the streets of the old city, a space with a documented oral tradition behind it, and a scientific investigation that confirms and extends that tradition, would be a discovery of enormous public significance, not just for historians and archaeologists, but for the broader public that visits Quebec City in search of a connection to the past. There is a particular poignancy to the Quebec case that the Australian and American cases that have been studied in parallel do not quite replicate, and it comes from the specific situation of the Huron-Wendat Nation at Wendake. The Wendat community at Wendake is not a diaspora community maintaining a tradition about a distant ancestral homeland. They are living within the urban agglomeration of the very city that was built on the site of their ancestors' most significant landscape feature. They travel past the streets of the lower town, past the foot of the cliff of Cap Diamant, past the entrance to the basement, through which three men with lanterns descended in 1898, and found something that confirmed what their grandparents had always said was there. This is a form of historical experience that does not have a comfortable category in the standard narratives of colonial history. The Wendat are not absent from Quebec City. They are present in it, actively, as a recognized First Nation, with a land base and a governmental structure, and a program of cultural revitalization, and a specific claim to the pre-contact heritage of the site on which the city was built. Their presence transforms the question of what is beneath Cap Diamant from an abstract archaeological puzzle into something more immediate and more charged, a question about whose history this is, about who has the right to investigate it and interpret it, and about what the acknowledgement of the pre-contact underground spaces means for the ongoing relationship between the Wendat nation and the institutions of the city that was built on their territory. These are political and ethical questions, as much as they are archaeological ones, and they cannot be separated from the scientific investigation of the chamber in the way that a purely technical research program might wish to separate them. The investigation of the chamber is inherently an act with political and ethical dimensions, because the chamber is on land that has a specific political and legal status, because the knowledge about the chamber is held by specific communities whose rights to that knowledge and to participation in any investigation of it are recognized in Canadian law and in international Indigenous rights frameworks, and because the findings of any investigation will have implications for how Quebec City understands and presents its own history, which is itself a politically and culturally charged domain. This is not an argument against investigation. It is an argument for approaching investigation with the seriousness and the respect that the full complexity of the situation requires. The investigation that is needed here is not a standard archaeological research project conducted by university academics with the legal minimum of Indigenous consultation. It is a collaborative research program in which the Wendat Nation and the Algonquin Nation are full partners in the design, conduct, and interpretation of the research, in which the oral tradition knowledge is treated as a co-equal source of evidence, alongside the geological and archaeological evidence, and in which the findings are interpreted and presented in a framework that respects the sovereignty of Indigenous knowledge systems, rather than subsuming them into a standard Western scientific narrative. The question of what the 1898 expedition found has a simple answer and a complicated answer. The simple answer is a chamber in the limestone of Cap Diamant that showed evidence of human modification containing ochre and worked stone objects and organic remains and wall markings, with an additional passage leading deeper into the rock that the expedition did not enter. The complicated answer is everything else: the geological context, the oral tradition background, the archival threads from 2 centuries of construction records, the broader pattern of pre-contact underground spaces in northeastern North America, the methodological and epistemological questions about how we know what we know about the pre-contact past, and the political and ethical dimensions of the ongoing relationship between Indigenous nations and the institutions that have historically managed the interpretation and investigation of their ancestral territories. Both answers are true. The simple answer gives the specific content of the discovery, the particular things that 3 men found when they went below the surface of Quebec's oldest quarter in 1898. The complicated answer gives the meaning of the discovery, what it connects to, and what it implies about things that matter beyond the specific dimensions of a single limestone chamber. Meaning is something that human beings create in the act of connecting things, of placing particular events and observations in relationship to broader patterns and longer histories. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant has waited more than a century for the connections to be made, for the various threads of evidence to be drawn together into a picture that gives it the context it deserves. That picture is incomplete, because the investigation that would complete it has not been conducted. But the outline of the picture is visible in what has been assembled, and the outline suggests something important about the length and depth of human history at one of the most significant geographical locations in northeastern North America. The St. Lawrence Narrows at Quebec City have been a place of human significance for at least 12,000 years. The promontory of Cap Diamant has been a landmark, a navigational reference, a ceremonial place, a strategic location, and a memory for that entire span of time. The underground spaces in the limestone of Cap Diamant have been part of that story, maintained and used and remembered through periods of cultural flourishing and periods of catastrophic disruption, passed down in oral traditions that the Wendat nation has carried for centuries and continues to carry today. The broader story of pre-contact Canada is itself a subject that has been inadequately represented in Canadian public history and education, and the Quebec case is one particularly vivid example of a general pattern. Canada's history curriculum, across most provinces, treats the pre-contact period briefly and in broad strokes, acknowledging the presence of diverse Indigenous peoples without conveying the depth and complexity of the civilizations they had developed over thousands of years. The result is a public understanding of pre-contact Canada that is, in the most literal sense, underestimated, a failure to appreciate the scale of human achievement that preceded the colonial period and that provided the foundation of landscape knowledge, trade relationships, and cultural sophistication on which the colonial period was built. This underestimation serves the interests of a narrative of colonial development that requires a relatively empty and undeveloped continent to have found. If the pre-contact history of Canada is rich and complex, and thousands of years deep, if the landscapes that European colonizers encountered were not wilderness, but managed territories with long histories of human modification and cultural significance, then the founding claims of colonial property and colonial development look different than they do against the background of a supposedly empty and unused land. The political dimensions of historical narrative are never more visible than in the treatment of pre-contact history, where the choice of what to emphasize and what to minimize has direct implications for the legitimacy of ongoing land claims and the obligations of the Canadian state to Indigenous nations. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant sits at the intersection of all of these questions. It is a physical fact in the limestone of a promontory that has been continuously occupied for 12,000 years. It is an archaeological discovery that was made and noted and then allowed to fall into institutional limbo. It is a subject of oral tradition knowledge maintained by a community living within sight of the place it describes. It is a potential site of investigation that could transform what is known about pre-contact human activity in one of the most historically significant places in Canada. And it is a question that has been sitting open for more than a century, waiting for the combination of institutional commitment, Indigenous partnership, and scientific method that would produce an answer. The stone of Cap Diamant does not care about any of this. The limestone keeps its temperature, its darkness, its particular quality of patience that stone has in the presence of human urgency. The ochre in the northern recess, if it is still there, has been red for a very long time. The wall markings have been on the eastern wall since whoever made them stood in the lamplight that the archaeologist stood in 1898, and perhaps in the lamplight or firelight of people who were old when the French colonial era began. The rock holds what it holds. The question is whether the people above it, on the cobbled streets of the old town, in the institutions that manage its history, in the communities whose ancestors made it what it is, will find the combination of will and partnership and method to finally ask the rock what it knows. The relationship between the Wendat tradition and the physical space is itself a subject of considerable subtlety, and it is worth spending some time with it before moving toward the final dimensions of this story. In Western intellectual traditions, there is a tendency to think about knowledge and the things that knowledge is about as separate. Knowledge is something that exists in minds and texts. The physical world is something that exists independently of the knowledge about it. This separation feels natural in the framework of Western epistemology, but it is not universal, and in many Indigenous knowledge traditions, including those of the Wendat, the relationship between knowledge and the physical world is more intimate and more reciprocal. When Wendat knowledge keepers speak about the rooms within the rock at Cap Diamant, they are not simply referring to an external physical feature that their tradition happens to have information about. They are describing a relationship between their community and that place, a relationship that has been maintained over generations and that is itself part of what the tradition preserves. The knowledge is not separate from the relationship, it is the form that the relationship takes in the medium of language and ceremony and transmission across time. To investigate the chamber scientifically, in this framing, is not simply to gather data about an external physical reality, it is to enter into a relationship with a place that already has relationships, to bring new instruments and new methods into a conversation that has been going on for a very long time. This is one of the things that the collaborative research model gets right when it is done well. It acknowledges that the investigation is not happening in a social or relational vacuum, that the place being investigated is already embedded in a network of relationships and meanings, and that the most productive investigation is one that works within those relationships rather than imposing itself on top of them. The Crater Lake Research Collaboration, in which Klamath tribal representatives and USGS geophysicists worked together in a program that explicitly acknowledged the Klamath tradition as a source of research hypotheses, produced results that neither partner could have produced alone. The Budge-BIM collaboration, in which Gunditjmara knowledge about their aquaculture system guided archaeological investigation, produced findings that transformed understanding of the antiquity and sophistication of Indigenous engineering in Australia. The Quebec case has the potential to produce results of comparable significance if approached with comparable respect for the relational character of the investigation. The tradition is specific, and the geography is known, and the archive is fragmentary but real, and the combination of these three elements is the foundation for an investigation that could answer the question of what is beneath Cap Diamant, with a precision that neither the tradition alone nor the instruments alone could achieve. The archival thread from the 1898 expedition is not quite as thin as it might appear from the primary accounts alone, and a fuller exploration of what the archive contains adds texture and specificity to the story. Beyond the geologist's letters and the archaeologist's journal, beyond the Society Proceedings notice and the newly discovered letter to the Society President, there are several additional fragments that deserve mention because they indicate that the 1898 findings circulated more widely within the Quebec intellectual community than the absence of published follow-up would suggest. A brief reference to the expedition and its findings appears in the correspondence of a French-Canadian historian who was active in the Quebec Literary and Historical Society in the early 20th century and who wrote extensively about the pre-contact and colonial history of Quebec. His reference, in a letter to a colleague in Montreal, describes the 1898 findings as the most significant discovery of recent memory, but notes that the difficulties of pursuing the investigation in the context of the lower town's development made follow-up practically impossible. This is a different reason for the absence of follow-up from the institutional inertia explanation. It suggests that the development pressure on the lower town in the early 20th century, which was considerable, created a physical as well as an intellectual obstacle to returning to the site. A second reference appears in an account of Quebec City's underground infrastructure, written in the 1930s by a municipal engineer who had been involved in the construction of sewer and water mains in the lower town. His account, which is a practical document concerned primarily with engineering challenges rather than history or archaeology, includes a passing reference to the existing literature on the void spaces beneath the lower town and cites the 1898 expedition as having documented the most significant of these voids. He does not describe the chamber in detail, but his citation of the expedition in a practical engineering context suggests that the findings were known to people working on the city's infrastructure and were considered relevant background for understanding the subsurface conditions in the area. A third reference, the most intriguing of the additional archival fragments, appears in the personal memoir of a man who worked as a guide in the city in the first decade of the 20th century and who had some connection to the local French-Canadian community's oral tradition about the underground spaces. His memoir, written in old age in the 1950s, includes a brief account of the 1898 expedition that he had heard about secondhand from a member of the local French-Canadian labouring community, and his account of what he heard adds one detail that does not appear in any of the primary documents, that the guide who led the expedition into the basement had told people afterward that the chamber was not the only space he had been in below Cap Diamant, that he had been in other spaces on other occasions, that his family's knowledge of the underground spaces extended beyond the single entry point used in 1898. This detail, if accurate, would suggest that the French-Canadian labouring community in the lower town maintained a practical familiarity with the underground spaces of Cap Diamant that went beyond family oral tradition to include direct experience of those spaces. It would mean that the chamber and the passage network it was part of were not entirely inaccessible in the period around 1898, that there were people who moved through them and who knew them as real places rather than merely as inherited stories. If that is true, then the question of where those access points were and whether any of them survived the development of the early 20th century becomes practically urgent rather than merely historical. The memoir writer was not a careful historian. His account is personal and discursive and oriented toward the anecdotal rather than the systematic, but he is describing something that he heard from someone who worked in the relevant community at the relevant time, and the specificity of the detail he adds, that the guide had been in other spaces, on other occasions, beyond the 1898 expedition entry point, is the kind of detail that is likely to reflect something real in the original account, rather than being an invention. People who fabricate oral tradition details generally do so in ways that are consistent with established expectations. An unexpected detail, like the existence of multiple access points to the underground system, is more likely to be accurately reported than to be invented. If the underground spaces of Cap Diamant were accessible from multiple points in the period around 1898, and if those access points were known to the local French-Canadian community, in addition to the Wendat and Algonquin communities, whose oral traditions pointed to the spaces from a different direction, then the archive of potentially relevant information extends beyond the Wendat and Algonquin oral traditions and the 1898 expedition documents to include whatever traces remain of the French-Canadian neighbourhood oral tradition about the underground spaces. This tradition, if it can be documented at all, would likely be found in the memories of older residents of the lower town or in the oral history collections that have been gathered by community organisations and institutions in Quebec City over the past several decades. There have been modest efforts to gather oral history from long-time residents of the lower town, efforts associated with the preservation of the neighbourhood's historical character and with the documentation of local traditions and memories. Whether any of these efforts have captured material relating to the underground spaces is not currently known, because the connection between the local oral history collection projects and the specific question of the underground spaces has not been made. This is another gap in the existing research, a gap that could be addressed relatively easily by anyone with access to the relevant oral history collections and with the specific question to ask of them. The accumulation of these additional archival fragments, beyond the primary documents that have been previously examined, deepens the picture of what was known about the underground spaces in the period around and after 1898. It was not a single eccentric expedition that found a mysterious chamber and then disappeared into silence. It was a discovery that circulated within a specific intellectual and social community that was considered significant by the people who heard about it, that encountered practical obstacles to follow up, and that was noted and referenced in ways that left traces across multiple archival sources. The silence in the official scholarly literature is real, but beneath that silence is a considerably more active circulation of the discovery than a simple reading of the silence would suggest. The context for the 1898 expedition within the intellectual history of Canadian archaeology is worth examining more carefully, because it illuminates the specific character of the institutional response to the discovery. In 1898, the dominant figures in Canadian prehistory were associated with the Geological Survey of Canada, which had been conducting systematic investigations of the geological and archaeological record since the mid-19th century. The survey's approach to Indigenous prehistory was shaped primarily by the evolutionary framework that dominated Anglo-American anthropology in the late 19th century. The framework associated with Lewis Henry Morgan in the United States and Edward Tyler in Britain, which organized human cultures into a hierarchy of stages, from savagery through barbarism to civilization, placing contemporary Indigenous peoples at various lower stages of this sequence and treating archaeological evidence of past Indigenous activity through the lens of what was expected from societies at those stages. Within this framework, evidence of complex pre-contact Indigenous cultural activity in northeastern North America was genuinely difficult to accommodate. The peoples of the northeastern woodlands were classified at the lower end of the barbarism stage, capable of simple horticulture and organized social life, but not of the sophisticated engineering and ceremonial architecture that would place them in a higher category. An underground chamber with work surfaces and ceremonially significant contents did not fit this classification. It belonged, if anywhere, to the barbarism stage, but to a higher level of that stage than the northeastern woodland peoples were supposed to have reached, and the implications of that mismatch were deeply uncomfortable for a framework whose purpose was partly to justify the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their territories on the grounds of their cultural incapacity for the kind of sophisticated land use that justified sovereign possession. This is the ideological dimension of the institutional response to the 1,898 findings. And while it is not the whole story, it is a significant part of it. The evolutionary framework of late 19th century anthropology was not simply an innocent intellectual model that happened to place Indigenous peoples at lower cultural stages. It was a model that served specific political purposes, that provided a scientific legitimation for the territorial dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and that defined what kinds of evidence about Indigenous cultural achievement were allowable and what kinds were not. Evidence that Indigenous peoples of northeastern North America had been constructing and using underground ceremonial spaces was not allowable, not because anyone decided to suppress it, but because the intellectual framework in which it would have to be evaluated had no place for it and no motivation to create one. The reform of that framework, which is still ongoing, has been driven largely by the accumulation of archaeological evidence that cannot be accommodated within the evolutionary model, evidence from the Hopewell earthworks of Ohio, from the Mississippian centers of the Southeast, from the long-distance trade networks that extended across the continent, from the increasing appreciation of the sophistication of Indigenous land management practices and the complexity of Indigenous political and social institutions. The Quebec case is one additional piece of that accumulation, one more data point in the argument for a fundamentally different understanding of what pre-contact Indigenous life in North America looked like and what it was capable of. The Hopewell comparison is worth pursuing briefly because the Hopewell interaction sphere, which flourished roughly 2,000 years ago across an enormous geographic range in eastern North America, had a presence in the St. Lawrence Valley and represents the kind of cultural complexity and long-distance connection that helps explain what a ceremonial underground space at the St. Lawrence Narrows might have meant in its cultural context. Hopewell is not a single culture in the sense of a single political entity. It is a name given to a widespread network of cultural practices and trade relationships that connected communities across a vast region, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Mississippi Valley to the eastern seaboard. The materials that moved through the Hopewell network: obsidian from Yellowstone over 2,000 miles to the west, copper from the Lake Superior region, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, speak to a level of long-distance trade and cultural connection that is one of the most remarkable achievements of pre-contact North America, and that the standard public narrative of the period enormously underestimates. The presence of Hopewell-related practices in the St. Lawrence Valley has been documented at a number of sites, including several in the Quebec region. The cultural connections that the Hopewell network maintained were not just economic exchanges of valued materials. They were maintained through ceremonial gatherings, through the shared use of cosmological frameworks and ritual practices, and through the exchange of knowledge and technique that made participation in the network meaningful. Ceremonial spaces, where the practices of the network could be enacted and the relationships among its participants maintained, were an important part of the infrastructure of the Hopewell world. A ceremonial underground space at the St. Lawrence Narrows, at the critical geographical point where the estuary meets the river interior, where the coastal and riverine trade routes converged, where peoples from across the northeastern part of the continent met in the course of their seasonal movements, would fit naturally into the ceremonial geography of the Hopewell world. It would be a place where the participants in the eastern end of the network could enact the practices of the network's ceremonial tradition in a setting that combined natural drama with specific cultural significance, where the darkness and depth of the underground space reinforced the meaning of what was done there. This does not mean that the chamber was a Hopewell period construction. The Hopewell period is roughly 2,000 years ago, and the chamber may be older or more recent, or may have been used over a much longer period that included, but was not limited to, the Hopewell era. But the Hopewell context helps to place the Quebec case within a broader picture of pre-contact North America that includes sophisticated long-distance trade networks, complex ceremonial traditions, and the kind of organized social capacity needed to maintain sites of ceremonial significance across a vast geographic range. There is a quality to the St. Lawrence River at the Narrows that goes beyond its geographical significance. In the early morning, when the mist comes off the water and the city above is still quiet, the river moves with a patience that feels ancient, that feels like it is entirely indifferent to the centuries of human activity on the cliff above it. The water moves as it has moved for 10,000 years, as it moved when the first post-glacial communities followed the retreating ice northward and found this remarkable place where the river narrows and the cliff rises, as it moved when the maritime archaic hunters paddled their craft through the mist in pursuit of the beluga whales that still come up the estuary each spring. There is something in the character of this place, in the combination of the river's scale and the cliff's height and the particular quality of the light on the water, that makes it easy to understand why it has always been significant, why every culture that came here found it to be a place that demanded attention and ceremony and the kind of careful relationship that people develop with places that matter. The geography speaks. You do not need a tradition or an archive to feel that this place has been important for a very long time. You can feel it standing at the foot of the cliff, watching the river. What the tradition and the archive add to that immediate sense is specificity and depth. The tradition tells you that the place was important in specific ways, that the importance was understood and acted upon by the people who came before, that the underground spaces of the cliff were part of how that importance was expressed. The archive tells you that this understanding left physical traces that have been encountered and noted by people of very different cultural backgrounds and very different periods over more than 2 centuries of colonial occupation of the proof site. And the geology tells you that the physical conditions for the creation and preservation of underground spaces existed and continue to exist in the rock of Cap Diamant. Together, these 3 dimensions of the evidence produce a picture that is more than the sum of its parts. It is a picture of a place that has been known and used and cared for by human beings for as long as human beings have been in this part of the world. A place whose underground character was part of its meaning, and whose underground spaces were part of how its human significance was maintained across generations. The chamber that 3 men found in 1898 and did not fully investigate is one node in this much larger picture, one point where the accumulated meaning of the place crystallized into physical form in a way that is recoverable by modern investigation if the investigation is undertaken. The question of what specifically was preserved in the northern recess, what the worked stone objects were, and what they represented in their cultural context, is one that deserves extended speculation even in the absence of the data that would permit confident answers. Speculation, properly labelled as such, is a legitimate part of the process of formulating hypotheses for investigation, and the things that might have been preserved in a ceremonial underground space in the street. Lawrence Valley over a very long period are worth imagining as specifically as the evidence permits. Ground and polished stone objects in northeastern North American archaeological contexts include a remarkable range of forms and functions. Banner stones, carefully ground stone objects that served as atlatl weights and that are among the most aesthetically refined artifacts of the Archaic period, appear in the archaeological record of this region from about 8,000 years ago through the end of the Archaic. They are made with care and precision that goes beyond functional necessity, ground and polished to a finish that reflects aesthetic intention, and they appear in burial contexts and in hoarding contexts that associate them with specialized knowledge and elevated status. A collection of banner stones in a ceremonial underground space would be entirely consistent with the Archaic period cultural context of the region. Gorgets, flat ground stone objects with perforations for suspension, appear in similar contexts across the Archaic and into the woodland period. They are often associated with specific roles or functions within the social organization of the communities that made and used them, and they appear in burial contexts that suggest they were items of some importance, worth burying with the dead and worth preserving in special contexts. Ground stone vessels of various kinds, used in food preparation and probably in the preparation of ceremonially significant substances, appear in the archaeological record of the Street, Lawrence Valley and the Great Lakes region through multiple periods. Any or all of these object categories are consistent with what the archaeologist described in the 1898 account of the Northern Recess. His language, worked stone objects, polished, suggests the characteristic surface treatment of Archaic period ground stone, and his description of multiple objects of varying character suggests a collection rather than a single artifact, consistent with the kind of deliberate assembly of significant items that appears in caching and hoarding contexts across northeastern North American archaeology. The association of such a collection with red ochre is particularly evocative, because ochre appears in precisely the kinds of burial and hoarding contexts where important ceremonial objects are preserved. The maritime Archaic at Port O'Shoy covered their dead with ochre and placed among the grave goods exactly the kinds of objects that would be consistent with the Northern Recess contents: banner stones, gorgets, carefully ground stone tools, and the equipment of specialized ritual practitioners. If the chamber beneath Cap Diamant was associated with the maritime Archaic, or with one of its successor traditions, the Northern Recess would be exactly the kind of deposit that those traditions produced. Port O'Shoy is 500 kilometers from Quebec City, on a different coast, on the other side of a significant geographical barrier. But the maritime Archaic peoples who used Port O'Shoys were using the same coastal and riverine highway system, the same network of waterways along the Atlantic coast and up the major rivers that would naturally bring them to the St. Lawrence Narrows. Their characteristic red ochre burial practices, their ground stone tool tradition, their long-distance trade networks connecting communities across an enormous geographic range, all are the kind of thing that does not stop at an arbitrary geographical boundary. They followed the coast and the rivers to where the resources and the relationships took them, and the Street, Lawrence Narrows at Quebec City was one of the most significant nodes of the entire northeastern coastal and riverine system. The timing matters here. The maritime Archaic flourished from roughly 5,500 to 3,500 years ago, a 2,000-year span during which the peoples of the northeastern coast developed and refined their remarkably sophisticated maritime and riverine adaptation. Within this period, the sea level along the northeastern coast was approaching its current configuration, though with significant regional variation due to the continuing adjustment of the landmass following the removal of the glacial ice load, the process geologists call isostatic rebound. The detailed hydrography of the Street, Lawrence Estuary during the maritime Archaic period was different from today's in ways that would have affected navigation and the distribution of marine resources, but the basic character of the Narrows at Quebec City was already established. The place was already a significant navigational feature. The later woodland period cultures of the Street, Lawrence Valley, which succeeded the Archaic traditions, inherited and built upon the knowledge and relationships developed over thousands of years of Archaic period activity. The woodland period ceramics, the increasingly complex burial practices, the development of the Hopewell interaction sphere, all represent elaborations of a cultural foundation that was itself very old. The Wendat Confederacy that Cartier encountered in 1535, with its sophisticated political organization and its extensive trade relationships, was not a sudden development of the immediately preceding centuries. It was the culmination of a long process of cultural development that extended back through the woodland period into the Archaic, and that drew on the accumulated knowledge and relationship networks of thousands of years of human presence. In the St. Lawrence Valley, understanding the chamber beneath Cap Diamant in this context, as one element in a 10,000-year history of human engagement with one of the most significant geographical locations in northeastern North America, changes the register of the question. It is no longer a question simply about a chamber found in 1898 and never properly investigated. It is a question about the entire depth of human history at a place that has been at the center of human activity in this part of the world for as long as human beings have been here. A a question about what that history actually looked like and what it means for the understanding of who we were before the categories of colonial history were imposed on what we had been. There is an acoustic dimension to the story of the chamber beneath Cap de Metan that has not yet been addressed, and it belongs in any serious consideration of what the space might have been and what it might have meant. The archaeologist Igor Reznikov and his colleague Michel Devois published a paper in 1988 in the Bulletin de la Société préhistorique française that transformed how archaeologists think about the relationship between cave paintings in the painted caves of southwestern France and the acoustic properties of the cave systems in which those paintings are found. What Reznikov and Devois demonstrated through systematic acoustic surveys of the major decorated caves was that the areas of highest painted concentration were also the areas of highest acoustic resonance, the places where sound was amplified and transformed and given particular qualities by the shape of the cave walls and ceiling. The painted animals appear not randomly distributed on available wall surfaces, but concentrated in the acoustically most significant parts of the cave system. This finding has been extended and developed in the decades since by a growing body of acoustic archaeology research that has examined the relationship between sound and sacred space in cave and underground contexts across many cultures and many periods. The results consistently show that the people who used these underground spaces paid attention to their acoustic properties, chose the most resonant locations for the most significant activities, and in some cases appear to have modified cave surfaces to enhance their acoustic character. The selection of underground spaces for ceremonial use was not purely visual or tactile, it was also acoustic, and the particular qualities of sound in enclosed underground spaces, the way sound reverberates and transforms and seems to come from the rock itself, were part of what made these spaces appropriate for the activities conducted in them. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant, as described in the 1898 accounts, would have acoustic properties that are predictable from its described dimensions and geometry. A chamber, approximately 15 meters long and 8 to 10 meters wide, with a ceiling at standing height throughout, in a limestone substrate, would produce sound behavior that is markedly different from open air. The reverberance time, the time it takes for a sound to decay after its source stops, would be significantly longer than in any above-ground setting. Sounds produced in the chamber would persist and would seem to fill the space with a lingering quality that has no equivalent in ordinary experience. Voices would take on a different character. Percussion would produce sustained resonance. The chamber would be, in acoustic terms, a profoundly unusual space. For people whose ceremonial practices included vocal performance, percussion, and other sound-producing activities, which is to say, virtually all pre-contact cultures in northeastern North America for whom we have any evidence, this acoustic character would not have been incidental. It would have been part of the meaning of the space, part of what made it suitable for the activities conducted there. The way that sound behaves differently underground, the way it seems to inhabit the rock rather than simply bounce off it, the way that a voice or a drum seems to come from everywhere at once in a resonant limestone chamber, would have been interpretable within indigenous cosmological frameworks as evidence that the space had a particular spiritual character, that it was a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay behind the rock was thinner than elsewhere. The connection between acoustic properties and spiritual significance in underground spaces appears across cultures worldwide, with a consistency that suggests it reflects something deep about how human beings respond to the particular phenomenology of sound in enclosed limestone environments. Stephen Waller, an American archaeologist, has proposed that the acoustic properties of some rock art sites in the American Southwest were specifically associated with the choice of those sites for painted images, and his argument has been extended by others to cave art sites in Europe and in Australia. The Murujuga petroglyphs in Western Australia, where acoustic surveys have found correlations between engraving density and resonance properties, and the Carnarvon Gorge Cathedral Cave in Queensland, where systematic acoustic measurements have found reverberation times significantly longer than surrounding areas, both point in the same direction. That the acoustic character of underground spaces was recognized and incorporated into the cultural significance of those spaces by the people who used them. Whether the chamber beneath Cap Diamant was chosen partly for its acoustic properties, or whether those properties were discovered through use and then incorporated into the ceremonial tradition associated with the space, is a question that cannot be answered from the existing evidence, but it is a question that a properly designed acoustic survey of the chamber would be able to address, because the acoustic properties of the space are determined by its dimensions and substrate and are directly measurable with modern instruments. If the acoustic properties are as significant as the geometry of the described space would suggest, that would add another dimension to the picture of why this particular place in the limestone of Cap Diamant was chosen and modified and used over the long period that the evidence implies. The acoustic survey, in the context of a collaborative investigation of the chamber, would be one of the most technically straightforward elements of the research program. It requires no excavation, no sampling, no physical disturbance of the site. It requires simply the introduction of a measurement system into the space and the systematic collection of acoustic data. The data would characterize the space in terms that are directly relevant to understanding its significance, its resonance time at various frequencies, the distribution of acoustic energy within the chamber, the relationship between the acoustic properties of the main chamber and the passage leading to it, and ideally, the acoustic character of the second passage and whatever lies beyond it. If the acoustic properties of the chamber are particularly striking, if the resonance time is dramatically longer than would be expected from the described dimensions, that would suggest the possibility of a coupled volume effect, meaning that the chamber's acoustic properties are influenced by the void spaces connected to it by the second passage, and that the two chambers together create an acoustic system significantly more resonant than either would be alone. This would be consistent with the hypothesis of a connected network of void spaces beneath Cap Diamant, and it would transform the second passage from a tantalizing unknown into a specific acoustic prediction that could be tested against measurement. A modern investigation of the chamber would ideally be structured in stages, beginning with the non-invasive and building toward the more detailed and more interventive as the earlier stages confirm and refine the picture. The first stage would be geophysical, a systematic ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography survey of the surface area above the described chamber location, designed to detect the void space and characterize its dimensions and its relationship to the surrounding rock. This stage requires no access to the underground. It is conducted entirely from the surface above, and it would produce a three-dimensional map of the void spaces in the relevant area that would allow planning of all subsequent stages. The second stage would be the identification and assessment of access. If the geophysical survey confirms the presence of a void space consistent with the 1,898 descriptions, the next question is how to reach it. The original entry point through the basement of a building in the lower town may no longer be accessible, given the century of construction and redevelopment in the area. But if the void network is as extensive as the available evidence suggests, there may be other access points that have been created or revealed by the intervening century of construction activity. The geophysical data would guide the search for access, identifying the points where the void space comes closest to the modern surface and where construction records suggest that contact between the void and the built environment has occurred. The third stage, once access has been established, would be reconnaissance, a careful initial examination of the accessible portions of the space, conducted under conditions that minimize physical disturbance, focused on confirming the character of the features described in the 1898 accounts, and identifying the priorities for the more detailed investigation that would follow. The acoustic survey would be conducted during this stage, as it requires access to the space but causes no physical disturbance. Photography and three-dimensional scanning would produce a complete record of the space's current condition. The fourth and most consequential stage would be the careful archaeological investigation of specific features, the worked surfaces for sampling and dating, the northern recess for recovery and analysis of its contents, the wall markings for detailed documentation, and the second passage for reconnaissance and assessment of what lies beyond. This stage would be designed in close collaboration with the Wendat Nation and the Algonquin Nation, whose oral tradition knowledge would inform the specific research questions asked and the interpretive framework applied to the answers. The fifth and ongoing stage would be the interpretation and communication of the findings, in forms and through channels appropriate to all of the communities with a stake in the results. The Indigenous nations whose ancestral heritage is at stake. The scholarly communities in geology and archaeology and history, whose research this would transform, and the general public whose understanding of the pre-contact history of Canada would be enriched by a properly conducted and properly communicated investigation of what lies beneath one of the country's most visited historical sites. One of the things that makes the Quebec case distinctive among the various pre-contact underground sites that have been studied or proposed in recent years is the specific combination of archival depth and oral tradition specificity that it offers. Most potential pre-contact underground sites in North America are known either from oral tradition alone, without corroborating archival documentation, or from archival documentation alone, without the specific geographical precision that oral tradition can provide. The Quebec case has both, and the two lines of evidence point to the same location and describe the same general character of what is to be found there. This convergence is unusual, and it makes the case for investigation stronger than it would be with either line of evidence alone. The archival documentation is rare precisely because underground spaces, encountered during construction, are almost never described in terms that suggest anything other than a geological anomaly. The 1898 expedition is unusual in having participants trained to observe and report on what they found in ways that go beyond the engineering necessity to deal with the void and move on. The geologist's training in observing and describing rock surfaces gave him the vocabulary to note and report the character of the worked surfaces. The archaeologist's training in the cultural interpretation of built and modified spaces gave him the vocabulary to note and report the significance of the chamber's contents and markings. Without the particular combination of expertise that the three expedition members brought, the 1898 encounter with the chamber would almost certainly have produced a record no more informative than the engineering records that routinely noted and then ignored such features. The oral tradition specificity is also unusual in ways that deserve recognition. The Wendat tradition about the rooms within the rock at Cap Diamant is not a general tradition about the significance of underground spaces, of the kind that appears in many indigenous cosmological frameworks. It is a geographically specific tradition about a specific location, a specific feature of that location, and the specific uses of that feature. This specificity is the hallmark of a tradition that is transmitting empirical information about a real place, rather than using a real place as a vehicle for cosmological symbolism. The distinction matters, because the cosmological symbolism would survive even if the physical feature it references were entirely imaginary, while the empirical, geographical claim would be falsified by the failure to find the feature in the described location. The fact that the empirical, geographical claim has been partially confirmed, that three trained observers in 1898 found a feature in roughly the described location with roughly the described character, is significant. It is not complete confirmation. The chamber has not been fully investigated, and the full extent and character of the underground spaces beneath Cap Diamant remains unknown. But it is confirmation at the level of initial positive result, the kind of result that justifies the further investigation that would produce complete confirmation, or, if the initial result is somehow misleading, the disconfirmation that would close the question definitively. The story of Canadian pre-contact history has been expanding in recent years in ways that provide increasingly rich context for understanding what the chamber beneath Cap Diamant might mean in the longer sweep of human presence in the country. The announcement in 2021 of the remains of children at the sites of former residential schools redirected public attention in Canada toward the full scale of the colonial project and its violence. Less dramatically but no less significantly, a series of archaeological and genetic discoveries over the same period have been filling in the picture of pre-contact Canadian history with a richness and complexity that was not available even 2 decades ago. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed the field in the past decade, making it possible to reconstruct population histories and migration patterns with a precision that no other method can achieve. In Canada, ancient DNA research has traced the peopling of the country from the initial entry of the first peoples from Asia at the end of the last glacial maximum, through the subsequent population movements and turnovers that shaped the regional cultures of the contact period. The results confirm a deep and complex human history in Canada that began at least 15,000 years ago, and that involved multiple episodes of migration, admixture, and cultural transformation before anything resembling the contact period Indigenous nations took shape. In the state, Lawrence Valley specifically, ancient DNA work at burial sites in Quebec and Ontario has documented the deep antiquity of human presence in the region and the complex relationship between the archaic, woodland, and contact period populations. The genetic continuity and the genetic change visible in this record both tell important stories. Continuity suggests that the cultural knowledge of the region was transmitted across a long period within related populations, while change suggests that the cultural knowledge was also shared and modified through contact and admixture with peoples from other regions. The underground spaces of Cap Diamant, if they have been used across this long and complex period, would have been encountered and used by peoples of significantly different genetic backgrounds, who nonetheless shared the common thread of their engagement with the street. Lawrence Valley and its particular demands and opportunities. The old copper complex of the Great Lakes region, which produced remarkable copper artifacts, beginning roughly 8,000 years ago and continuing for several thousand years, is another element of the pre-contact picture that helps contextualize the Quebec case. Old copper complex peoples worked Lake Superior native copper into tools and ornaments with a sophistication that required not just access to the metal, but a social organization capable of coordinating the extraction, transport, and working of the material. The distribution of old copper complex artifacts, which extends through the Great Lakes region and down the major river systems, shows that these peoples were connected to the street, Lawrence Valley, and to the communities that occupied it. The knowledge and the connections that made old copper complex possible were maintained across the same network of rivers and relationships that connected the northeastern woodlands and the street. Lawrence Narrows at Quebec City was one of the nodes of that network. The legal and political context for any investigation of the chamber has changed substantially since the 1990s, when the historian of science made her recommendation for a geophysical survey, and the change has been largely in the direction of making such an investigation more possible rather than less. The amendments to the Quebec Cultural Heritage Act in 2012 strengthened the requirements for archaeological assessment prior to development in areas of identified archaeological potential, and Cap Diamant and the adjacent Lower Town have long been identified as areas of high archaeological potential. Any new construction or significant subsurface intervention in the area would now require an archaeological assessment that would include, if properly designed, an examination of the potential for pre-contact underground features. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada endorsed in 2010, and which the Government of Canada formally adopted into domestic policy with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in 2021, establishes standards for free, prior, and informed consent for research activities that affect Indigenous peoples and their cultural heritage. While the practical implementation of UNDRIP in Canadian research contexts is still evolving, the legal and ethical standard it establishes is clear. Research involving Indigenous peoples' ancestral territories and cultural heritage requires their meaningful participation and consent, not merely the consultation that was previously required. This standard, applied to an investigation of the chamber beneath Cap Diamant, would require genuine partnership with the Huron-Wendat Nation and the Algonquin Nation from the design stage of the research forward. The specific claims process in Canada, through which Indigenous nations can make claims for compensation or redress related to the breach of treaty obligations or the unlawful disposition of Indigenous lands, is a dimension of the legal context that is directly relevant to the Quebec case, even though it has not been the primary driver of scholarly interest in the chamber. The Huron-Wendat Nation and various Algonquin nations have active land and treaty claims in the Quebec City region, and the existence of a significant pre-contact cultural site beneath the historic district of Quebec City has potential relevance to those claims, not because the chamber alone would determine the outcome of any claim, but because it is evidence of the depth and character of Indigenous occupation and use of the territory prior to European colonization. This is a dimension of the Quebec case that requires care in its framing. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant should be investigated because it is a genuinely important archaeological site whose investigation would advance understanding of pre-contact human history in northeastern North America, not primarily because it might be useful in legal proceedings. The legal relevance is real and should be acknowledged, but it should not be the primary framing of the research question, because research driven primarily by legal strategy tends to ask narrower questions than research driven by genuine curiosity about the past, and the questions that the Chamber raises deserve the fullest possible scope of investigation. There is a tourist dimension to this story that deserves at least brief acknowledgement, because Quebec City is one of the most visited historical sites in North America, and the character of what visitors encounter there shapes the public understanding of Canadian history for millions of people every year. The city's official historical narrative, as presented in the interpretation of its museums, its fortifications, its churches, and government buildings, is a narrative of the French colonial period, the British colonial era, and the particular drama of the survival of French language and culture in a British North America that eventually became Canada. It is a genuinely compelling and genuinely important narrative, and it is well told. But the city sits on a promontory that human beings have occupied for 12,000 years, and the stories of those 12,000 years of human presence are not told. They are present in the archaeological record, fragmentarily but real. They are present in the oral traditions of the Wendat Nation, whose community at Wendake is close enough to the old town that its members pass through the historic district regularly. They are present in the geological character of the cliff itself, in the limestone that records the chemistry and the biology of 500 million years, and that contains the traces of 10,000 years of human engagement, in the void spaces below the city's cobbled streets. A visitor to Quebec City today who knows to look can find the pre-contact dimension of the site in the Musée de la Civilisation's permanent exhibition on First Nations of Quebec, which presents the cultures and histories of the Indigenous nations of the province with care and accuracy. They can find it in the interpretive programs at various outdoor locations in the historic district that acknowledge the Wendat and Algonquin presence on the site before and during the colonial period. They can find it in the visual and cultural presence of the Wendat Nation at Wendake, which is accessible to visitors and which presents its own community's history and contemporary cultural life in ways that give the pre-contact dimension of the site a living face rather than an archaeological abstraction. What they cannot find is the Chamber. The Chamber is not on any tour. It is not in any exhibition. It is not part of the interpretive program of any institution in Quebec City. It is in a private journal held in a university archive, in the private letters of a geologist who died in 1906, in a published scholarly paper that very few people outside a narrow academic audience have read, and in the oral traditions of the Wendat Nation, where it continues to be held by knowledge keepers who understand its significance, even if they cannot yet demonstrate it by the means that the dominant culture's institutions require. This is not a satisfactory situation for a discovery that was made more than a century ago, and that, if properly investigated, would transform the public presentation of one of Canada's most significant historical sites. What would it mean, concretely, for Quebec City's historical presentation to incorporate the full pre-contact dimension of the site, including the underground spaces that the 1898 expedition found and that the Wendat tradition describes? It would mean, first, the inclusion of the deep pre-contact history of Cap Diamant in the interpretive programs of the city's major museums and historical institutions. The 12,000 years of human presence that preceded the French colonial period would be given the same depth of treatment as the 400 years of colonial and post-colonial history that currently dominates the narrative. The maritime archaic, the woodland period cultures, the Wendat at Stadacona would not be brief background paragraphs but substantive sections of the story, with the evidence, the dates, the cultural specificity that brings them to life. It would mean, second, the development of an interpretive program specifically around the underground spaces of Cap Diamant, one that presents the geological character of the site, the oral tradition knowledge about the underground spaces, the 1898 expedition and its findings, and the current state of knowledge about what lies beneath the city's oldest quarter. This program would not have to wait for the completion of a full archaeological investigation. The story of the discovery and the question it raises is itself compelling and interpretively rich, and presenting it honestly as a genuine question that has not yet been fully answered, would engage visitors in the intellectual and historical dimensions of the site in ways that a simple presentation of established facts could not. It would mean, third, the development of the kind of collaborative relationship between the city's cultural institutions and the Wendat nation at Wendake that would make the full incorporation of the Indigenous dimension of the site's history a genuine partnership rather than a performance. The Huron-Wendat nation has cultural and knowledge resources that are directly relevant to the interpretation of the site, and a genuine partnership would bring those resources into the interpretive programs in ways that the nation controls and directs, not ways that are determined by the dominant institutions and then approved by the nation as a formality. These are ambitious goals, and the path from where things currently stand to where they should be is not a short one. But the direction is clear, and the evidence that points in that direction has been accumulating for more than a century. The chamber beneath Cap Diamant, if it is there, has been waiting with the patience of stone. The oral traditions of the Wendat have been waiting with the patience of a people who know that what they know will eventually be needed. The archive has been waiting in the drawer of an institution that has not yet asked of it the question that would make its contents speak. The St. Lawrence River, in early spring, carries an extraordinary quantity of ice. The winter closes the river, or much of it, and when the warmth comes in March and April, the ice breaks up and moves downstream in great irregular sheets and blocks that groan and crack as they go, a sound that carries for miles in the cold, clear air. For the peoples who have lived along this river for thousands of years, the breakup of the ice was one of the significant moments of the annual cycle, the signal that the world was returning from its winter contraction, that the river was opening again. That movement and trade and ceremony and the whole business of the warmer half of the year could begin. Standing at the foot of Cap Diamant in early spring, watching the ice move, it is possible to feel the weight of the time that has passed here, the succession of generations who stood in this same place and watched the same ice break and move. The river is not particularly interested in the succession of cultures that have used its banks. It moves as it has always moved, responding to the same physics, the same seasons, the same fundamental character of a large cold river in a northern climate. But the human dimension of the place, the accumulated significance of 10,000 years of people using it and naming it and fighting over it and building on it and going under it, is layered into the landscape in ways that are partly visible and partly not. The partly visible part is the city above, the fortifications, the Chateau Frontenac, the old buildings of the lower town with their steeply pitched roofs and their thick stone walls, the funicular that connects the two levels of the city, the whole remarkable fabric of a place that has been building and rebuilding itself for 4 centuries. The partly not visible part is everything before the French arrived. The Wendat village at Stadacona, the seasonal camps of the Algonquin, the trade canoes of Hopewell-era peoples moving through the Narrows, the maritime archaic hunters paddling in pursuit of beluga, and beneath all of that, in the limestone of the cliff, the chambers and passages that the tradition says were there, and that the 3 men with lanterns, in 1898, found and entered and never fully explored. The not visible part has a way of making itself felt, even to people who know nothing about it. Quebec City has an atmospheric quality, a depth, that visitors comment on without always being able to articulate what produces it. The depth is partly architectural, the concentration of historic buildings in a small area. It is partly geographical, the drama of the cliff and the river. But it is also partly something else, something that the conscious visitor experience does not explain, a sense that the place has been important for longer than the colonial narrative accounts for, that the weight of time is greater than 400 years of French and British history. That sense is not wrong. The weight of time here is real, and it extends back through the full 12,000 years of human presence at the narrows of the great river. The epistemological lesson of the Quebec case is one that applies far beyond the specific question of one underground chamber in one limestone promontory. It is a lesson about how knowledge is produced and validated, about what counts as evidence and who decides, about the relationship between the knowledge systems of dominant cultures and the knowledge systems of the cultures that dominant cultures have displaced or suppressed. These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are practical questions with practical consequences for what gets investigated and what does not, for what enters the public record and what remains in private journals and oral traditions, for what the next generation learns about the depth and complexity of human history in the places they inhabit. The Wendat tradition that says there are rooms within the rock at the place of the narrowing river is a claim about the world. It is a claim that can be tested, that has been partially tested by the 1898 expedition, and that warrants the further testing that a properly designed modern investigation would provide. The tradition does not ask to be believed without evidence. It asks to be taken seriously as a source of hypotheses about the physical world, hypotheses whose empirical content can be assessed by physical investigation. This is not a contradiction of scientific method. It is an extension of it, an extension that recognizes that good hypotheses can come from many sources, and that the source of a hypothesis does not determine its validity, which is established by the evidence that tests it. The three men who went below Cap Diamant in 1898 were operating within the intellectual frameworks of their time, and those frameworks limited what they could see and what they could do with what they saw. They saw a chamber. They saw work surfaces and wall markings, and a collection of objects of cultural significance, and a second passage leading deeper into the rock. They could not understand fully what they were looking at, because the conceptual tools for understanding pre-contact indigenous underground ceremonial spaces in northeastern North America did not exist in their intellectual environment. They could not follow up adequately because the institutional resources for such a follow-up were not available or organized in the right way. We have different conceptual tools now. We have the acoustic archaeology framework developed by Reznikov and extended by his successors. We have the oral tradition methodology developed by Nunn and Reed and others who have demonstrated the empirical accuracy of specific tradition content. We have the collaborative research models developed in Australia and in the American Southwest and elsewhere that have shown how indigenous knowledge and scientific methods can work together to produce results that neither can achieve alone. We have the ancient DNA methods that can reconstruct population history from physical remains recovered from underground spaces. We have the geophysical survey methods that can characterize the void network of Cap Diamant from the surface above. We have the legal and ethical frameworks that establish the rights of indigenous nations to meaningful participation in research about their ancestral territories. What we do not yet have, in the Quebec case, is the decision to use these tools in the service of the question that has been sitting open since 1898. That decision has not been made because no institution has yet decided that it is a priority, because the combination of scholarly attention and institutional commitment and indigenous partnership that the investigation would require has not yet come together in the right configuration at the right time. This is not unusual. Most important archaeological investigations that eventually happen have a prehistory of unresolved questions and unfollowed leads that can stretch for decades or generations before the conditions for the investigation finally align. The conditions for the investigation of the chamber beneath Cap Diamant are closer to being aligned now than they have been at any previous time. The scholarly framework is more developed, the legal and ethical standards are clearer. The indigenous communities whose partnership is essential are more actively engaged in research about their ancestral territories, and the public interest in the full and honest history of Canada's pre-contact past has grown substantially. The question is whether a particular combination of individuals and institutions will recognize this alignment and act on it before the next opportunity for accidental discovery, the next major construction project in the lower town, creates another brief window of access that is then closed by the concrete and rebar of the new development. The race against development is a real dimension of the urgency of this investigation. Urban archaeological sites are under constant pressure from construction activity, and the lower town of Quebec City is not immune to this pressure. Major infrastructure projects, building construction and renovation, the continuous maintenance and modification of a city that is also a living place and not merely a historical monument, all create opportunities for the kinds of accidental discoveries that have been documented repeatedly in the construction records of the past 2 centuries. But accidental discoveries made in the context of development activity are almost always limited by the demands of the development. They are noted, sometimes sampled, and then covered over or bypassed because the development cannot wait for the kind of thorough investigation that the discovery merits. A systematic investigation conducted in advance of development, designed to characterize the underground spaces of Cap Diamant before the next phase of construction activity creates its particular set of disruptions and constraints, is the methodologically and practically preferable approach. It is an approach that requires institutional foresight and coordination rather than the reactive scrambling that accidental discoveries typically produce, and it is an approach that is feasible given the tools and frameworks that currently exist. The question is not whether the investigation is possible, it is whether the will to conduct it can be assembled before the next construction project in the lower town renders the question moot by destroying the access or the evidence. In the Wendat cosmological framework, as it has been documented by ethnographers and as it is maintained by Huron-Wendat knowledge keepers today, the world is organized into three levels: the sky world above, the middle world of ordinary experience, and the underworld below. These three levels are not entirely separate. They interpenetrate, they communicate, they are in relationship with each other through particular places and particular practices. Places where the boundary between the levels is thin, where movement between them is possible, are places of particular significance and particular power. The limestone cliff of Cap Diamant, with its underground spaces, its springs emerging from the base of the cliff, its position at the point where the great river changes character, is exactly the kind of place where, in the Wendat cosmological framework, the three levels of the world come into proximity. The underground spaces are literally within the earth, in the underworld dimension of the site. The springs that emerge at the cliff base are the underworld's waters coming into the middle world. The height of the cliff reaches toward the sky world. The narrows of the river mark a threshold in the middle world itself. This cosmological reading of the site is not merely metaphorical. It is a way of understanding the physical character of the place in terms of a framework that gives the physical character meaning and that guides the practices associated with it. When the tradition says that the rooms within the rock were used for important practices and for the preservation of important things, it is also saying that those practices and those things belong to the dimension of the site that relates to the underworld, to the zone below ordinary experience, to the realm of what the Wendat tradition calls the powers beneath. The ochre in the northern recess, the worked stone objects, the wall markings, the deliberate modification of natural limestone voids, all of these make sense within this cosmological framework as the material evidence of practices designed to engage with and maintain the underground dimension of a site of exceptional cosmological significance. The physical and the cosmological are not separate in this framework. The physical features of the site, its geology, its hydrology, its position in the landscape, are the material expression of its cosmological character, and the practices associated with the site, the ceremony and the preservation and the transmission of knowledge, are the human response to a cosmological reality that the physical features make tangible. This is not superstition. It is a sophisticated way of relating to the physical world that integrates the observable properties of place with the cultural and spiritual meanings that human communities attach to those properties. A way of relating that has sustained the Wendat and their ancestors in relationship with this particular stretch of the St. Lawrence for thousands of years. The closing meditation of this story belongs not to the investigators or the institutions, but to the place itself, to the limestone and the river, and the 12,000 years of human presence that have shaped both into something that is more than geology and more than geography. It belongs to the tradition that has carried the knowledge of what is beneath the rock through generations of disruption and survival and renewal. It belongs to the question that is still open, that has been open since 1898, and in a different and deeper sense has been open since the first peoples came to the narrows of the great river and recognized it as a place of significance that deserved and required their attention. The limestone of Cap Diamant does not know how old it is. It does not know that it has been keeping secrets in the way that human stories describe secrets. It holds what it holds because that is the nature of stone. The temperature inside the void spaces, around 8 degrees Celsius, does not change, regardless of what is happening above or below on the surface. The darkness inside is complete. The silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the very faint sound of the river transmitted through the rock, is the silence of a place that has not been disturbed for a very long time. In that silence, and that darkness, and that cold, whatever the 1,898 expedition found has been waiting. without impatience, without any awareness of waiting, in the way that only physical things in the earth can wait. The Wendat tradition is still held by the community at Wendake. The language in which it was first formulated, Wendat, is being revitalized by a community that refused to let it die. The children of that community are learning it, adding it to themselves the way the limestone adds itself layer by geological layer, slowly and with absolute commitment to what it is. The tradition they will carry includes the knowledge of the rooms within the rock, the knowledge that their ancestors maintained for centuries through conditions that should have ended it, that the ground at the place of the narrowing river holds something that the old ones made and that the earth kept safe. And so, they do not know exactly what the instruments would find if someone finally brought them below the city's cobbled streets and pointed them at the right place in the right rock. They know what their tradition says is there. They know that the tradition has been right about things before. They wait with a patience that comes from knowing that the stone is patient, that whatever is in the rock will still be there when the decision to look for it is finally made. The river moves. The tides come up from the estuary as they have always come, pushing the fresh water of the interior back a little, mixing the salt and the sweet at the narrows in the way that the old traditions describe as a boundary between worlds. The beluga still come up the river in spring, fewer now than in the old accounts, but still coming, their white shapes visible from the cliff. The ice still breaks in March and moves downstream with its groaning and cracking that the first peoples heard, and that Cartier heard, and that Champlain heard, and that the people of Quebec City hear still, gathered at the edge of the cliff or along the waterfront to watch the annual violence of the river reclaiming itself from winter. Below all of this, in the limestone, in the darkness and the silence and the unchanging cold, the ochre waits. The wall markings wait. The worked stone objects in the northern recess wait. Slatch, the second passage, the one that the three men with lanterns could see into but could not enter, waits with whatever it connects to, with whatever the tradition says is deeper in the rock, with whatever the old ones made and left and trusted to the stone to keep. The question of what is down there is the oldest unanswered question that Quebec City is sitting on, older than the city by thousands of years, answered in the tradition and waiting for the instruments to confirm what the tradition has always said. The ground keeps what was given to it. The river keeps moving. The knowledge waits. The comparative weight of what is known and what is unknown in the Quebec case should itself be a subject of reflection, because the ratio of known to unknown is unusual for a site in the middle of one of Canada's most visited cities. In most urban archaeological contexts, the extensive development and construction that characterizes city life has produced, as a side effect, a substantial body of archaeological data about what lies beneath. Cities are excavated regularly, if inadvertently, by the infrastructure demands of urban life, and the accumulation of archaeological observations from those excavations, properly documented and synthesized, typically produces a reasonably detailed picture of the subsurface archaeology. The picture is never complete, but it is often rich enough to answer basic questions about what was there, when it was there, and what it was used for. The Quebec case is unusual because the observations that have been made are extensive enough to establish the existence of the feature, but not extensive enough to characterize it adequately. The pattern is the opposite of what you would expect. Many brief encounters with the underground spaces, none of them long enough or systematic enough to produce the data that would resolve the question. This pattern suggests that the underground spaces are encountered frequently enough to be a routine feature of construction experience in the lower town, but not often enough, or in conditions suitable enough for the kind of detailed examination that would be definitive. The spaces are there, the construction records confirm, but they are encountered in conditions that make investigation impossible and that prioritize the completion of the construction over the documentation of what was found. This is the essential frustration of the Quebec case, and it is a frustration that is experienced by anyone who works through the archival record carefully. Evidence accumulates, but does not resolve. Each new thread of evidence confirms the general picture, but adds specificity only at its margins. The core question, the precise character and extent and age of the underground spaces, remains unanswered, not because the evidence points in different directions, but because the evidence that exists is too fragmentary to be definitive, and the investigation that would produce definitive evidence has not been conducted. The frustration is itself a kind of evidence that the question is real, and significant, and not easily dismissed. That it persists across more than a century of development and scholarly attention, because there is something genuinely there that deserves and resists easy categorization. The patience required to hold this question open, to maintain it as a genuine research priority across the decades, and the institutional changes that shape what any given generation of scholars can investigate, is the same patience that the stone exercises without effort. It is a patience that the Wendat tradition models in its maintenance of specific geographical knowledge across centuries of disruption. It is a patience that the archival record rewards in the way that careful examination of fragments that were never meant to be read together produces a picture that none of them individually suggests. It is the patience of anyone who takes seriously the proposition that the full depth of human history in this remarkable place is worth knowing, that the 12,000 years before the French arrived deserve the same careful investigation and honest presentation as the 4 centuries after, and that the question sitting in the limestone beneath the cobbled streets of Quebec's old town will eventually, when the conditions are right and the will is assembled and the partnerships are formed, yield the answer that the tradition has been holding all along. And so the story of 1898 remains exactly what it has always been, an incomplete investigation of a real place, a real discovery that opened more questions than it answered, a thread running from 3 men with lanterns in a limestone passage into the full depth of 12,000 years of human engagement with the most dramatic geographical feature of the northeastern St. Lawrence Valley. The thread does not break. It runs continuously from the maritime archaic to the Wendat, to the 3 men, to the historian who found the journal, to the geographer who mapped the voids, to the scholars who have since assembled the pieces, and to the question that still waits, patient as limestone, steady as the river, for the investigation that will finally follow it all the way to its source. The cliff stands above the river moves below the cliff. In between, in the dark and the cold of the limestone, something waits, that was old when Cartier looked up and called it diamond.